Hello there and welcome. I'm Rosanna Lockwood and you are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. The head of Hamas in Gaza confirms the killing of leader Yahya Sinwar by Israeli forces after Israel releases drone footage of his final moments. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the conflict with Hamas will continue as US President Joe Biden says it's time to move on and reach a ceasefire following Sinwar's death. And Donald Trump and Kamala Harris head to Michigan today in a bid to woo voters in this all-important key swing state. Welcome. Well, in a televised address, Hamas's Khalil Khaya has paid tribute to the memory of the, quote, fallen martyr, Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, describing Sinwar as, quote, steadfast, brave and intrepid, stating he sacrificed his life for the cause of our liberation.
We mourn the great leader, the martyred brother, Yahya Sinwar, Abu Ibrahim, Hamas political bureau chief and commander of the Al-Aqsa flood battle. The hostages will not return unless the aggression against our people in Gaza stops and Israeli forces withdraw from the besieged territory. Additionally, we call on Israel to release the Palestinians held in its jails.
Well, this comes after Israel released a video from an Israeli drone showing the Hamas leader sitting in a bombed building before throwing a piece of wood at the drone shortly before he was killed during a routine search for Hamas members. His body's identity was later confirmed with DNA records. Our correspondent Sarah Coates is in Tel Aviv for us this evening. Sarah, just give us the main takeaways from what we've heard from Israel's military and government today about the killing of Sinwar.
Hello there, Rosanna. What we can tell you is that there is a high-level meeting happening right now, not far from where I'm standing. That is at the IDF headquarters, the Curia, right here in Tel Aviv, as Israel's top-ranked security officials go over the events of really the last 24, 48 hours and decide what happens next. Now, what we can tell you is that this happened by chance. That is according to the Israeli military. We do know that an infantry brigade was on patrol in the Tal al-Sultan area, that is down in the southern end of the strip, an area inside Rafah. They then engaged with a number of Hamas fighters on the ground, and it was only after these fighters were found to be deceased that these troops realised that one of these bore a very strong resemblance to the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. Now, we do know, according to Israeli authorities, that his body was then taken to Israel. This actually happened on Wednesday, we do need to add, taken to Israel for forensic testing, DNA testing, testing on the teeth. And what we do need to remember here is that Yahya Sinwar was imprisoned in Israel from 1988 to 2011. So the Israelis certainly had a lot of information with regards to his DNA, his biometrics and that sort of thing to actually determine that this was him. But it is certainly something that it is being celebrated here in Israel. And once again, right now, a very high-level meeting happening not far from where I am as Israeli officials try and decide on the next steps. Rosanna.
And Sarah, are those celebrations, as you're saying there in Israel, obviously for the killing of Sinwar, whilst that might be among the military and the government, is that also being felt in the public? Do people feel safer? Is there a sense there of safety or fears of retaliation?
I wouldn't say at all a sense of safety, but really this is something that Israelis have wanted to happen for a very, very long time. Yahya Sinwar has had an X on his back for many, many years. He was Israel's most wanted man. He was seen as the architect of the October 7 atrocities, and he's really been the one that the Israeli authorities have been trying to track down and kill. Now, shortly after this announcement, Rosanna, we actually saw IDF officers in certain parts of the country pulling up cars on the road and trying to hand out sweets. So certainly there was a lot of jubilation with regards to the public. People were happy that this happened, but not all of them, because we do need to remember that there are still 101 Israeli hostages that do remain in the Gaza Strip. And right after this announcement from the Israeli military yesterday that came out to say Yahya Sinwar eliminated, the family members of these people, they took to the streets. They were calling on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to use this opportunity, to leverage this opportunity, to do a deal now and to bring these people home. Now, separately, I did mention this high-level security briefing that is taking place right now. Well, there's also a separate meeting that's set to happen, and that is with regards to these hostages. Now, what we've been hearing from the United States and other global players, really, is that they're trying to use this opportunity also to leverage a deal to get these people back, to leverage a deal to end the war in Gaza. But right now, the rhetoric that we are hearing from Netanyahu and also senior Hamas officials, they're not budging from these positions. Benjamin Netanyahu says the war will continue, troops will continue to fight, while senior Hamas leaders have said that there will be no release of Israeli hostages until there is a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. So it certainly is a very difficult situation. And we have heard from the US President Joe Biden just over the last couple of hours. He was speaking in Berlin, and he said it's going to be much easier to find sort of a diplomatic situation or solution, I should say, between Israel and Hezbollah than it will to end the war in Gaza.
In terms of retaliation, if there is more to come, how is the government preparing for that at the moment?
Well, in terms of retaliation right now, the retaliation that's being spoken about here on the ground is Israel's retaliation to Iran for that unprecedented ballistic missile attack that took place on the 1st of this month. We have to remember that there were around 200 ballistic missiles shot into Israel by Iran. Israel is promising to retaliate to that. It's basically just a matter now of when and what it hits. Now, Biden also spoke about this on his visit to Berlin. He said he's aware of when this will happen. He's aware of what Israel will strike, but he wouldn't elaborate any further. Now, we are hearing that the Israelis have given the Americans guarantees that they will not go after oil facilities, they will not go after nuclear facilities, and they will instead go after military targets. But in saying that, it is an extremely tense time here in the region. Israeli forces have been told to stay on very, very high alert because the Iranians have been saying that if they are attacked, there will be no red lines and they will strike Israel back. So it really is being seen as sort of a vicious cycle of violence with no end in sight. And once again, it is a region bracing for what comes next. Rosanna.
Sarah Coates, our correspondent in Tel Aviv this evening. Thank you. Well, staying with this story, let's get more now with the former US National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. John, always good to see you on the show. Thank you. And I want to start by asking your reaction when you first heard the news about the killing of Sinwar yesterday and the way in which it was done and discovered. What were your thoughts?
Well, I thought it was a good day for the world. This is a vicious, barbaric terrorist who has finally met his fate. Better late than never. And I think it points to the very significant damage that Israel has done to this particular proxy for Iran in the Gaza Strip. I think there's more work to be done. I don't think there's any reason for a ceasefire. I think Israel should continue to try and achieve the objective it set out immediately after October 7, which is to eliminate Hamas as a military and political force.
You think that Netanyahu should proceed with that strategy, not get around a negotiation table and talk about ceasefire yet?
Negotiate with whom and for what? You want to end the conflict in Gaza? Why don't people ask Hamas to surrender?
Do you think that's a possibility? I mean, so the alternative is continue militarily flattening and trying to weed out every Hamas terrorist in Gaza?
Yeah, it's how you win World War II. You demand, as the United States did, unconditional surrender from Japan and Germany, and you fight until they agree to it.
And that's obviously a very big departure from what current US President in his final days of his presidency, Biden, is saying today, asking for that ceasefire, asking for Netanyahu's cabinet to work towards that. So do you think the US government's on the wrong track?
And it has been for over a year. They have not acknowledged the real strategic reality in the Middle East, which is this is not a Hamas war against Israel. It's not a Palestinian war against Israel. It's an Iranian war against Israel, of which Gaza forms one front. And that's why, really, I think the decision Israel is now confronting as to how to respond to the second ballistic missile attack against its territory from the territory of Iran on October the 1st, what they're going to do about it. Just to put this in context, the October 1 attack by Iran was the largest ballistic missile attack in human history.
In Berlin today, I believe it is, Joe Biden speaking to reporters. A reporter asked him, do you know how Israel is going to retaliate and when? And he said yes and yes. And she said, will you tell me? And he said no and no. Do you think it's true that Biden does know how and when Israel's going to retaliate?
I'd be surprised, actually. I don't buy the argument that they have necessarily agreed not to attack the nuclear and oil facilities. I think the nuclear program is a military program. And indeed, it's the most dangerous program, not just for Israel, but for the United States. And as a matter of counter-proliferation policy, really dangerous for the world as a whole.
In terms of the possibility of ceasefire elsewhere in Lebanon, Biden quite confident that that's something that might be achievable, but acknowledging it will be harder in Gaza. So do you think he does understand that it is going to be difficult to negotiate with Hamas?
I think he's dreaming. I don't think you can negotiate with terrorists in good faith. That's not the way they are. And I think it's the systematic destruction of the terrorist threat that's necessary.
Will it require negotiation with Hezbollah in order to ensure a ceasefire in Lebanon?
Well, after their stockpile of missiles is destroyed, the CIA in its public fact book, obviously published long before this conflict broke out, estimated, this is what they say publicly, estimated that Hezbollah had up to 150,000 missiles. So I think if I were facing that terrorist threat, I wouldn't be satisfied until the threat had been eliminated.
I find it interesting speaking to terrorist experts in interviews over the past few weeks, talking about whether it's possible to do what was done with the Islamic State with ISIS in terms of weeding them out root and branch and almost getting rid of the organization for good. Do you really think that's possible with Hamas?
Sure. Why shouldn't it be possible? You know, if you look at what happened in Germany after World War II with an aggressive denazification program, having eliminated really the Nazi infrastructure, Germany's now gone almost 80 years without a resurgence of Hitlerite Nazism. So I think if you have the will and the resolve, and I think most importantly, if the Gazan residents see a world without Hamas's intimidation, and I think it's coming into view, then you can have the prospect of Hamas truly being eliminated. And I think people telling you how hard it is haven't lived under what the Israelis lived under on October 7th.
It obviously presents a very difficult challenge, post, say, elimination of current-day Hamas, not to have generations of radicalized young people who saw their families bombed and killed for years in Gaza and elsewhere in the region. Do you think it really is possible to get away from that? I'm talking, you know, when you're sat in the Middle East and speaking to people who may have experience or family in Palestine or Gaza or Lebanon or anywhere else at the moment, the feelings are very strong about the way that Israel has conducted this. Do you think it's really possible for people to see outside of that?
Sure. I think they have to ask themselves why they allowed Hamas to use their families and friends as human shields. the war crimes that have been committed in Gaza are entirely Hamas's responsibility. You know, the West has spent a couple hundred years trying to separate innocent civilians from combat. Hamas's whole strategy is to put innocent civilians at the center of the conflict as human shields. That's the barbarity. And people in Gaza should ask themselves, is that the kind of regime they want to see imposed on them again?
Is it going to require more US support for Netanyahu to carry through his military aims in Gaza if he's going to continue the war in the way that he says he is, the way that you would advise him or support him in doing? Is it going to require yet more US military assistance, of course, the sending of sort of anti-missile defense systems and things like that, but also US troops?
I don't think it will require U.S. troops, although we do have troops on the ground that the Biden administration has put there to help man the anti-missile defenses that we've given. But look, this is what Israel's doing is defending the world against terrorism. They are systematically dismantling two pillars of the terrorist proxy network that Iran has set up over a period of decades. I think the U.S. could do more to help Israel. I think we could do more to dismantle the Houthi terrorist network. And I'm very pleased that in the past day or two, the Biden administration has sent B-2 bombers with what are called massive ordnance penetrators, that is to say, bunker busters, to break up the arsenal that Iran has provided to the Houthis. You know, it's been a principle of American foreign policy since we were a country to advocate freedom of the seas. And what the Houthis have done, except for their favorites like tankers carrying Russian oil, is they have closed one of the world's most vital sea lanes, the Suez Canal, Red Sea Passage. And I think we ought to open it. And I think doing that means cutting off the Houthis' supply of rockets and drones from Iran and eliminating whatever capacity remains in Yemen for use against international shipping.
And the first time those B-2 bombers were used since 2017, showing the significance clearly of what was thought imperative. Former US National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, for another perspective in all of this, I'm now joined by the brother of Or Levy, who was taken hostage by Hamas back on October 7th last year. Michael Levy, thank you very much for making time to speak to us this evening. Just talk to me first about what your reaction was when you heard the news of the killing of Yahya Sinwar yesterday.
At first, it was a shock. I couldn't believe it on the first second when I heard. And my second feeling was hope that now that this evil person is out of the picture, the one who stopped all of the latest deals, now we might have a chance to seal a deal and get the hostages back.
In terms of the chances of sealing a deal, some people clearly want it. The United States being one there, Joe Biden, the president, they're pushing hard today to try and get a deal for the hostages and a ceasefire. But Benjamin Netanyahu, your prime minister, actually not seeming to want to take that route. How does that make you feel?
Honestly, I don't think this is the case. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government knows that there won't be a better chance than this one. And this is probably part of the negotiation. But I know that they understand that there won't be a better chance than this one.
So you have hope that Netanyahu and his cabinet are going to try and work out a way, whether it's militarily or diplomatically, to get the hostages back within the coming weeks?
I think it has to be combined, as always, because unfortunately Hamas don't want to negotiate without it. Would love to get the hostages back and end this war, but first they have to come back, and we have to find a way to do it. And the international community has to put more pressure on everyone involved, including the Qataris and the Egyptians, to make sure that Hamas is actually getting a deal, a serious one.
In terms of the ability to negotiate with Hamas, sources actually telling Al Arabiya that Yahya Sinwar recently, before his killing, rejected a deal which would have allowed him and his family to leave Gaza in exchange for releasing the Israeli hostages. When you hear that, what's your reaction?
This kept happening again and again and again. Sinwar rejected deals in the past almost 13 months now. And the fact that he's out of the picture means that we have a chance to find someone who can end this. And maybe we'll have a chance for a better future for both people in Gaza and in Israel.
Do you feel like you have enough support from the international community to get the hostages, get your brother home? Do you feel like the world is still paying attention?
The fact that my brother is still a hostage after more than a year now means that we didn't get enough support. But I think now we have a real chance to get my brother and the rest of the hostages back. And I think the international community has to do whatever they need to force Hamas to release them and seal a deal and end this war. As simple as that.
Brother of Or Levy, still being held hostage. Michael Levy, thank you very much for joining us. Well, President Biden has also said that NATO must sustain its support for Ukraine until the country can win a just and sustainable peace. He made the comments during his current visit to Berlin, where he's been meeting with key European allies. The president also using the visit to discuss the war in Gaza. From Berlin, Trent Murray's got more.
On what is expected to be his last visit to Europe while in office, President Biden is welcomed to Germany by Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Dear Joe, thanks again for taking the time for this visit. It is a strong signal of our transatlantic unity and of our friendship.
While the pair put on a show of unity, these talks come at a time where uncertainty exists over the direction of travel on Europe-US relations. The prospect of former President Trump returning to the White House has unnerved some European capitals, especially on the issue of military aid to Ukraine, as Trump says Europe needs to do more and the US less. Biden sought to allay those concerns by calling for continued support.
America and Germany are the two largest supporters of Ukraine in its fight for survival as a free and independent nation. As Ukraine faces a tough winter, we must sustain our resolve, our effort, and our support.
Well, there are undoubtedly some very difficult conversations taking place in that building right now. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have flown in to join this summit. We understand the simmering tensions in the Middle East are high on the agenda. After Israel confirmed the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, President Biden said he hoped it could mark a turning point in the war on Gaza.
The death of the leader of Hamas represents a moment of justice. He had the blood of Americans and Israelis, Palestinians and Germans and so many others on his hands. I told the Prime Minister of Israel yesterday, let's also make this moment an opportunity to seek a path to peace, a better future in Gaza without Hamas. And I look forward to discussing Iran.
And as President Biden departs back to Washington after a whirlwind 24-hour visit, it's likely for some of these European leaders it will be the last time they see him while in office, undoubtedly wondering what lies around the corner as a combative US election campaign looms large over the future of the transatlantic relationship. Trent Murray, Al Arabiya News, Berlin.
Well, let's get some of the other day's news now. North Korea has shipped 1,500 Special Forces troops to Russia's Far East for training and acclimatizing at local military bases. According to South Korea's National Intelligence Service, they'll likely be deployed for combat in the war in Ukraine. The agency saying they used facial recognition technology to identify North Koreans' officers in Donetsk region supporting Russian forces firing North Korean missiles. Reuters reporting North Korea shipped artillery rounds, ballistic missiles and anti-tank rockets to Russia in more than 13,000 containers since August last year. French Prime Minister Michel Barnier met with Italian ministers on Friday to discuss illegal migration. The two EU members are pushing for stricter border control. Next year, France and Italy planning to create a joint unit to crack down on migrant smuggling networks. King Charles III arrived in Sydney, Australia today on an official tour. It is the first visit in 13 years by a reigning British monarch to the country. King Charles and Camilla will be in Sydney and Canberra over 6 days before travelling to Samoa. This is King Charles's first foreign trip since his cancer diagnosis 8 months ago. And Liam Payne, former One Direction bandmate Niall Horan, has said he is absolutely devastated by the passing of his amazing friend. The 31-year-old fell from his hotel room balcony on Wednesday evening in Buenos Aires after flying in to see Horan perform on tour. The other members of the band also paid tribute to the star online. Police say they are still investigating the circumstances of his death. Well, to the US now, where former US President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris have traded blows again as the race to the White House enters its final stretch. Both took personal aim at the other candidate at different events on Thursday. Watching for us, our correspondent Benji Hire.
I'ma keep running 'cause the winner don't quit on themselves.
Another rally, another swing state, another swing at Donald Trump.
General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Donald Trump's top general, has called Trump, and I quote, fascist to the core. And it is clear Donald Trump is increasingly unstable and unhinged, and will stop at nothing to claim unchecked power for himself.
Kamala Harris's presence in Wisconsin meant she couldn't attend a campaign tradition, the annual Alfred E. Smith Memorial Foundation dinner, a white tie function in New York City to raise funds for Catholic charities, a chance to roast your political opponent in person or, if not, on screen.
Does it bother you that Trump guy insults you all the time? Because it really bothers my friends and me.
Oh, Mary Catherine, it's very important to always remember you should never let anyone tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. Let us recommit to reaching across divides, to seek understanding and common ground.
Common ground? This campaign is thin on consensus.
The two candidates for president are supposed to exchange good-natured barbs, and you know we get along very well. I didn't like Biden very much, and now I like him quite a bit. You know, and now I say that she's much worse than him. He was a much better candidate than her, actually. And when we hopefully win, dispose of her, I like her a lot, but right now I can't stand her. It's true. I can't stand her.
With the former president deep in his comedy routine material, it was left to fellow billionaire Elon Musk to stump for Trump in Pennsylvania. The businessman has poured money, resources, and his endorsement into the Republican ticket.
We want support of the Constitution and the right to, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. And that's what Donald Trump is going to do. So
time is running out to make the case to voters. Polls are already open in some states in a contest that's still too close to call. Benji Hire, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Well, let's get the latest from the campaign trail with our correspondent Caroline Malone, who's in Washington for us. And Caroline, what's been the reaction so far today, stateside, to the events of last night, those blows being traded?
Well, one of the also controversial comments that Trump made on Thursday was regarding the starting of the war between Ukraine and Russia. He actually took the blame and put it on Ukrainian President Zelensky and also the current president of the US, Joe Biden. He said it was their fault that the war started rather than the Russian president Vladimir Putin's fault, which of course goes against the grain of what most people in the United States believe, and indeed NATO allies across the pond. And we know, of course, that President Biden is in Germany at the moment doing precisely the opposite, trying to shore up support for Ukraine, in particular because they are concerned that Trump might get into power. And if he does, that could spell the end or have some concerns for Ukraine support ultimately. Also for, going forward, the amount of money the US spends on NATO and its allies there. So quite controversial comments made by Trump on Thursday on that. But, the president of the United States is already dealing with that, you could say, in Europe. Trump is also aware, and we've seen that in his comments this week, that he really needs to gain the support of more Latin American voters, Latinos living in the United States, whose demographic is crucial to him getting the kind of support he needs. He was at a town hall earlier this week speaking on a channel that's broadcast bilingually. We've actually seen some reaction to that on Friday with the Harris campaign, through some funding support for her, putting out a campaign in favour of Harris in some of the swing states, directed exactly to that demographic, to Latino Americans, to those who are bilingual speakers in particular. So really critical that both of these candidates at this point really hone in on every one of those individual voters who can make all the difference here.
Meantime, a small point, but Trump's press team has been pushing back on reports that, and this was specifically, I think, in Politico, that Trump has been pulling out of interviews because he's exhausted.
Yes, I mean, the campaign season is absolutely exhausting. Perhaps not surprising that anyone would find it tiring at this point, particularly, an older gentleman as Trump is at this point. He has been appearing on numerous stages. He's been in different places every day. He has been on different media outlets. But what we can certainly say about Trump is he seems to be favouring appearing on the more right-leaning, the more conservative news stations, being more picky about where he appears. Certainly on Friday, he was on Fox and Friends. That's on Fox News Channel. That, of course, is a very conservative channel and one that generally favours him and Republicans. He's also brought attention to something that he sees as an issue for his campaign when he spoke to Fox on Friday, saying he recognises that what's happened with abortion in the United States has actually hurt the support of women voters for him. He, of course, when he was last in office in the White House, helped to bring into the Supreme Court more conservative judges. They overturned Roe v. Wade, the constitutional right to abortion here. And then a lot of states have had a very harsh stance. What we've seen from Trump is that he's slightly backtracking now on his quite strong views on abortion, clearly because he's recognising that it could potentially hurt him quite massively with 50% of the population who votes here.
Well, quite elsewhere, a federal court releasing more evidence in Trump's election subversion case. What do we know?
Yes, so the election subversion case has been run by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. Now, these are cases that have been delayed and delayed and delayed to the point now where they won't happen before the election. And one big ruling that was made also by the Supreme Court earlier this year was that some of the evidence might actually come under presidential immunity for Donald Trump. What we've seen on Friday is 2,000 documents that Jack Smith and his team want to use as part of this court case. They've been released more publicly so that people can see what this evidence is, because they are pushing to have this evidence included in the case. However, there is a chance, because of this presidential immunity ruling by the Supreme Court, they actually might not be included in the case. Although, I must say, overall, there is one important point here. It doesn't seem to be making a difference to voters. Trump has his core supporters, his MAGA supporters, Make America Great Again supporters. They're going to vote for him regardless. We had a court case earlier in the year where Trump was found guilty for business fraud in New York. That really didn't impact the polls as much as we might have thought it would. In these other cases, both the election subversion cases and also one from Florida about classified documents, they're not going to be happening before the election. So people won't be using that potentially to decide on whether they vote for Trump or not. And even if these cases did happen, a surprising number of people don't seem to mind either way.
Our correspondent in Washington, Carolyn Malone. Thank you. To some business news now. Workers in Italy's automotive sector have marched to the streets of Rome, demanding more work and better conditions. The strike was called by the three main automotive unions in the city and comes amid rising tensions between global automaker Stellantis and the Italian far-right government. China's economy, meanwhile, grown by 4.6% year-on-year in the third quarter, the slowest pace recorded in 1.5 years. The latest figures coming as authorities have started to sharply increase stimulus measures to try to ensure the economy meets its growth target of around 5%. Russia's President Vladimir Putin saying BRICS countries will generate most of global economic growth. Speaking ahead of the BRICS summit, he said the group's total GDP growth is forecast at 4%, while G7 states are expected to grow 1.7%. Netflix announcing it is to raise prices in some countries. The company adding more than 5 million subscribers in the last quarter, but signalling slower growth. Ending September with around 282 million subscribers and a $2.4 billion in revenue. Netflix shares rising nearly 5% to $720.75 in aftermarket trades, which is slightly more than double the price from a year earlier. Your sport headlines now, and in football, Kylian Mbappe is back in training with Real Madrid after Swedish media reported he's been investigated by police over an alleged incident. The accusations follow a recent visit to Stockholm. Mbappe took to social media to deny the reports, calling them fake news. Manchester United manager Erik ten Hag has criticised the media for spreading what he called fairy tales and lies about his future. He faces intense pressure going into the international break after a streak of 5 losses, including a humiliating 3-0 home loss to Tottenham. After the match, former England midfielder Jamie Redknapp telling Sky Sports he thought ten Hag was out of his depth. Before we go, a reminder of our top stories here on Al Arabiya News. The head of Hamas in Gaza has confirmed the killing of the group's leader Yahya Sinwar after Israel released drone footage of his final moments. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying the conflict with Hamas will continue as US President Joe Biden says it's time to move on and reach a ceasefire following Sinwar's death. And Donald Trump and Kamala Harris head to Michigan today in a bid to woo voters in this all-important key swing state. Well, that's all the time we have. Coming up next is Riz Khan, and at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, join Tom Burges Watson for Global News Today, a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the third biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Well, many of the world's leading experts on cybercrime recently met in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, at the Global Cybersecurity Forum. They included senior figures from Interpol, GCHQ, and even a cyber psychologist and profiler who inspired the popular TV crime drama CSI Cyber. We'll get an in-depth look at the issues, starting with my first guest, Chris Inglis, who was appointed by President Joe Biden to lead cyber operations in the US. Chris, thank you for making the time. Much appreciated. Now, if cybercrime could be likened to the Wild West, it sounds like President Biden called you in to be the sheriff.
Yes, that's an apt metaphor in terms of that time. But I'd like to call it the coach, because like in the sport world, coaches are responsible for the game plan, the strategy, the assignment of that strategy to various role players, but they don't actually step onto the field and try to kick the ball, right? So they actually are responsible for the fabric within which the players operate. And so that really was the role, because cyber is wider than it is tall. That's a bit of a cipher, but it's really about how do you take all the pieces that already exist and apply them in a way that becomes coherent and effective.
That width makes it sound much harder to manage, because if it's a narrow, tall silo.
Oh, it is. If you're in charge of something and you can direct, because you're the smartest person in the room, and I've never been that person, if you can direct, then it's pretty straightforward. People simply obey your commands. But no one in the room is as smart as everyone in the room when the room is full of cyberspace, right? And so you just have to figure out, how do you actually then create a fabric within which all the pieces make sense? And it's made even more interesting because this is a collaboration that must exist between the private sector and the public sector. And in the United States, and I'm sure in many other places as well, the private sector doesn't work for the government works for the private sector. And so you can't subordinate one to the other. They have to actually be in a collaboration.
So I was thinking that perhaps the highest profile threat in a generation was those recent assassination attempts on President Donald Trump. Does cybersecurity have a role to play in that kind of situation, or is that just someone who's like an amateurish, low-tech lone wolf? And if that's the case, does it put them beyond detection from those kind of cybersecurity threats?
Well, I think it depends upon what your definition of a cyber threat is, and I think I would be expansive in that definition. We care about cyber threats because they might hold data or computers at risk. But we also care about it because the abstraction of data and computers delivers critical functions, like energy supplies, or for that matter, the ability to conduct an election. And so that critical function is an abstraction of the piece parts that are at the foundations. But cyberspace also delivers confidence. In a free and open society, depending upon a free and open architecture, the internet, we depend upon that to reliably meet our expectations. When I flip the light switch, I want it to go on. And if that confidence can be held at risk because of disinformation, or because of flows of information that are restricted or modified, then cyber's in play in terms of how people think about the threats in their world and react accordingly.
It's interesting you say it that way, because we've learned about death threats and assassination plots being levied by Iran against former President Trump, and Russian groups targeting US influencers in order to sway voter opinion on elections and election campaigns. How serious is the threat facing the US, and what do you see the role of cybersecurity being in countering them?
Well, let's use the Russian example. And I'm no longer a sitting government official, so I say this as a private citizen, but with the experience that I can bring to bear, I would say that my bet is that the Russians were not attempting to simply steal data, or to, for that matter, even hold the election at risk in 2016, 18, 20, this goes on every 2 years, but rather to hold the confidence of the United States at risk. I think that was the aim. And in that regard, it's a serious threat. If all you cared about is whether all the votes have been properly tallied, I don't think we have a significant threat. We actually know how to defend the digital infrastructure and the processes on top of that. But defending confidence, that's a matter that's altogether different and harder. And so what we have to do is to provide a solid foundation where there should be no question that the digital infrastructure is doing what it does. And at that point, then leadership takes over, hopefully enlightened, transcendent, leadership, which actually would make the case for democracy in this day going forward, that our best days are ahead of us.
It's so interesting because the way you're describing it, we're talking in effect about cyber psychology. The cybersecurity is essentially a psychological threat as well.
Well, it is, because what are the nouns of cyberspace? They're not just technology. The choices that people make predict what the cyber futures are going to be. And the assignment of roles, responsibilities, or not, also defines our cyber future. So to get all of those right, the human being is at least in 2 of those 3 pillars I just identified. Psychology is necessarily in play.
Really interesting. Now, many conflicts around the world follow strategies that have been used in previous engagements. But the world was taken aback by the Israeli operation to detonate pagers and beepers, and walkie-talkies were used by members of Hezbollah. What was your reaction to that? And was it a game changer in the way people have to think about cybersecurity?
I don't think it was a game changer in terms of the art of the possible. It might be a game changer in terms of whether someone's willing to use that. Look, cyber has kind of broadly three purposes. One is it helps us synchronize assets that are not in cyberspace, they're in the physical world. Again, I've talked about the flow of electricity, the conduct of an election. Those are physical kind of activities that have some tangible form, but we use digital infrastructure to synchronize those, to coordinate those. Cyber can actually have an effect inside cyberspace. I create a bank account, sustain a bank account, or might steal that bank account almost entirely in cyberspace. I would never do that, to be clear. But that all happens in cyberspace in the form of zeros and ones, bits. But cyber also has an effect on confidence, as we've talked about earlier. Back to my first point, cyber can coordinate physical assets in the real world. And if those assets are the walkie-talkies or the pagers that are carried in the pockets of Hezbollah, then cyber has always been capable of doing that. The question is whether we employ it for that purpose. And so we shouldn't be surprised about, what the art of the possible looks like when somebody finally effects it.
So this is that kind of threshold between, as you say, the ones and zeros and the real world impact.
Right. I think there's an oft-told, phrase in the United States, which is we sometimes suffer a failure of imagination, not realizing what the full kind of power of the technology or the systems, the connection of this technology, what that might be. And I think in cyberspace it's been ever thus. We need to think our way through what's the full power of this technology that we created, and is it still subordinate to our interest? Is it still something that serves our purposes as we would effect them? And are the values associated with how we use those something that we can not simply be proud of, but actually endure over time in creating the civil order that we prefer?
So is that kind of preemptive strike we saw against Hezbollah something the US could consider doing in a similar way? And how far can you go down the road from being, say, cyber defensive to cyber offensive?
The United States, along with a number of other nations, has signed what's called the UN Global Group of Experts, CODA. I think it was about 2015. That described a set of things that responsible nations should do in their use of cyberspace. And then one of those was that we would not hold critical infrastructure at risk or civilian populations at risk. Far be it from me to judge or to assess whether what the Israelis did against Hezbollah was kind of within the lanes of an ongoing war, and therefore under the laws of war might be deemed to be necessary and appropriate, proportional to that need. But I think that's the standard, that's the legal standard that we have to apply. What do we do to make sure that we are defending our populations, our civilian kind of activities in times of peace? And what do we do to exercise force, physical force, only in the realm of what's needed and what's proportionate to that need? Again, I'm not sitting in judgment of what the Israelis did, but that's the lens through which the United States would look at such a thing.
Well, I wonder, sir, then, is the concept of cybersecurity blurring the lines when it comes to setting rules and codes?
I don't think it blurs the lines, but it increases the possibilities, right? So cyber is an instrument of power. It's not the only instrument of power, and it's used in concert with other instruments of power. As you've already described, it can be used to control the instruments of war. It can be used to control the instruments of information dissemination or disinformation. It can be used to deliver critical functions. Cyber is integral to all of those things. It is a means, not necessarily the end to those purposes, and we need to think of it as such. Too often cyber is siloed as kind of the discipline that's kind of effected by IT specialists or cyber specialists, when in fact we're all implicated in cyber.
I wonder, when the US and Israel gave advance warning of a massive missile attack by Iran, is that the result of back-channel diplomacy, or does cybersecurity have a role to play in that?
I can't say. I wasn't involved in that particular action, certainly not in the government at the moment. But I would say, to the extent that one of the things that cyberspace can yield is information about the expectations, the aspirations of others, it is possible, plausible in my view, that cyber played a role in understanding what the expectations and intentions of Iran might be, and therefore gave not simply a source of that information, but a means to disseminate that information. Again, that's all hugely speculative on my part.
Looking at another conflict, what role has cybersecurity played in the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the Russians, who have, against all rules of law, tried to impose their will physically on the Ukrainians, have also tried to do so virtually in and through cyberspace. And against all odds, the Ukrainians have more than been able to defend themselves. The Ukrainians are numerically inferior to the Russians, and they perhaps don't have the depth of a bench in terms of access to technology that the Russians might. And yet the Ukrainians have succeeded in that regard. And how is that the case? The Ukrainians have invested enough in their technology so that it's defensible. It's not perfect. No one has the perfect technology infrastructure. They've invested a lot in their expertise so that they're world-class in their ability to defend that architecture. And finally, they've developed and deployed a coalition, such the Russians have to beat a range of organizations. They have to beat the Ukrainians, they have to beat private sector institutions, all of whom are assisting in the defense. They're not co-combatants. They're simply providing meaningful support to the defense. And I think that's actually a lesson for all of us, whether we're individuals, whether we're organizations. It's the strength of our coalition that's going to make the biggest difference, and the fact that we either do or do not know our disposition in cyberspace. If we get those two things right, then the technology is the lesser of our challenges.
Now, you've emphasized the importance of collaboration and cooperation both at a domestic and global level.
Yes.
When it comes to this issue. Now, do you fear the possibility of a more isolationist U.S. Foreign policy under, say, a second Donald Trump presidency could harm such cooperation with global partners and therefore kind of effectively weaken the U.S.'s defense?
Well, I'll leave it to the next president to decide what sort of engagement the U.S. should have with the rest of the world. But I do think that a reduction in the degree of collaboration the United States has with other countries is not simply to the collective detriment, but it's to the United States' detriment. There are perspectives and capabilities and, frankly, innovation that the United States alone cannot generate on its own behalf. And I think to the extent that any group of organizations or people in excess of one typically performs at a better level geometrically than single efforts.
We're seeing kind of technology spread just beyond domestic and international to space. So I wonder what role cybersecurity plays when it comes to space wars.
Well, that's a good question. That's highly speculative on my part, not being a space expert in any way, shape, or form. But I think that space is a natural extension, right, of our life on Earth. And there are strategic assets in space that allow us to live the lives we prefer on Earth. And if they were held at risk, we'd be much the poorer for it. The global positioning system, the GPS, comes immediately to mind. There probably isn't a person in this room that hasn't used some geolocation service to try to figure out how to get from point A to point B quickly. But package delivery services use that. The U.S. Postal Service uses that. We use that to synchronize things in time, not just space. That's one of many assets that are dependent upon space. And so if we held space at risk successfully, we would find egregious consequences here on Earth.
It's interesting when we look at the private sector and governments. Now, I wonder, in your opinion, to what degree can cybersecurity be trusted to the private sector, such as powerful players like Elon Musk, controlling, for example, a network of satellites?
Let's leave Elon Musk aside for the moment. That perhaps kind of conjures up all manner of things that are maybe kind of interesting, but not on my part well informed. But I would say that we have no choice but to cede a large part of this responsibility to the private sector. That's where innovation takes place. That's where capacity development takes place, deployment takes place. Defense, they're the first line of defense. So the private sector is, for want of any other viable solution, and I can think of none, they're really engaged in this, up to their necks. And we therefore have to appreciate that the government must support the private sector in creating a defensible architecture and actually defending that architecture, while not allowing or forcing the private sector to take on governmental responsibilities. There are certain responsibilities and authorities that must be retained by government. The ability to make war being one of those, diplomacy being those, speaking on behalf of nations that properly install governments. All of that's a governmental responsibility. But the government must support the private sector, which does most of the work by, with, and through cyberspace.
But effectively, the private sector has a lot of leverage over government because of the way things work as well now.
Well, they do. And so what I'm arguing for is not to essentially cede to each of those stovepipes, those silos, some degree of authority to operate as they do, but to achieve a degree of professional intimacy between those, a collaboration between those. In the United States, for much of our history, we've had a division of effort between the private sector and the public sector. They know one another, they meet at an interface, but each of them has a very different set of authorities, a different set of permissions in terms of how they proceed. And if we only got together and shared our knowledge at the moment of some extreme crisis, we find ourselves way behind, right, the crisis. So we have to actually have a professional intimacy at all levels of that, before a crisis, during a crisis, and our ability to act together, to intercede, to interdict, and to evict a crisis. Some of the best consultation between the private and the public sector should come as the government attempts to understand what its role can be. We need to take advice and counsel from the private sector. What do you need? How would you have us apply our governmental powers or our engagement of other governments? I think the private sector knows considerably more about the nature of the cyber domain than the government does, and yet they need government's assistance in actually doing the work required in that space.
And the framework, I guess, legislative framework. That
Exactly right.
All, yeah.
Exactly right.
Sir, I have to ask you, the recent CrowdStrike outage, the faulty software distribution, cost billions of dollars to businesses, it disrupted flights and medical facilities around the world, and yet it was the result of an error rather than a malicious attack. What do we learn from that about the dangers that exist in essentially what is such a connected world?
Well, that connectivity comes with consequences, some good, some not so good. Right, so if you have a singular dependency, some single point of failure, it might be that it has a low probability of failure, but it has an extraordinarily high consequence in that failure, as we learned in the CrowdStrike failure. And so we have to make sure that when we have single points of failure, we redouble our efforts to say it might be a low probability, but given the high consequence, we need to actually redouble our efforts to ensure we got that part right. And perhaps kind of go back and achieve a degree of redundancy or have a backup system in place. That was perhaps most surprising for organizations that depended upon that combination of CrowdStrike and Microsoft. On the day that failed, they had no backup, right? And so you might expect CrowdStrike and Microsoft to address that. I would expect them to. But companies need to actually think their way through, what would I do if this piece of my enterprise failed? And if the answer is, I don't know, then you're taking a risk that you probably don't fully understand, and you certainly are not going to like when it happens.
Well, showing that vulnerability, can cyber defense ever be 100%, or is it just a matter of time before a major cyber attack succeeds and maybe targeting vital infrastructure such as healthcare?
Well, somewhere in between. So to the first question of the three-part question, I would say that cyber defense can never be perfect. It's never possible. It's not possible to have a perfectly secure architecture, something that's impervious to all threats, for all time, that literally defends itself. The changing nature of the software, the hardware, and the engagement of people, right? The choices that they make, and the undulating nature of the assignment of roles response, it's just impossible to make it perfect. So at best, we can make it defensible. I'm not sure we've done that. We've not made it defensible, short of secure. And so I wouldn't say we're going to strive for mediocrity. Let's just make it defensible. That's actually the knee of the curve, which means we then must defend it, right? And so I kind of, on that, the second and third question, which implied, so is it inevitable that we fail? I don't think it's inevitable that we fail. It's inevitable that we meet with a cyber transgression with its criminal or nation state. We meet with one that actually gets through a first level of defense. It's not inevitable that they then succeed. If we know our architecture, which is people and technology and the assignment of roles and responsibilities better than they do, then we can actually be more agile, more maneuverable inside that space. We just have to be vigilant, catch it at the earliest possible moment, engage it, and evict it at the earliest possible moment. We can, in fact, respond well if we've set up such that we're inherently resilient and prepared to respond well. I think that the measure of merit for most companies today is not whether they'll never suffer a breach, but are they actually capable of enduring that breach? Can they actually respond and recover well? And there are a number of companies who've done that, and they march on. And there are companies who've not done that well at all. And the difference between the two is not whether they lived in a dangerous world or they suffered a breach, but were they prepared for that? And it's generally the quality of the team as much as the quality of the architecture that determines that result.
The role you took on was pioneering and must have been quite an eye-opener. because it was so kind of new. And I wonder, from that, what did you learn was the biggest threat people face from cybercrime? How well are they being protected? And what responsibility is there for individuals themselves to kind of take the lead?
What's surprising is still what I would describe as the proactive ambivalence on our part. And what do I mean by that? Everyone knows that there's an issue in cyberspace. I mean, there isn't a person that wouldn't say, yep, there's something wrong in that space. And yet so many of us say, I hope somebody else solves this, not realizing or not acknowledging that they have a part to play. And so I would say that there should be a consequence kind of imposed on those who transgress in this space. But we should first get our own house in order. Let's use the resources, the assets we already have. We've not done that.
Well, final thought, sir. It's often said that in cybersecurity, the weakest link is the human. And to make us all feel a bit more human, perhaps I could ask you, have you ever been hacked? Have you ever had your password forgotten or locked? Or, I mean, what have you experienced?
Oh, my goodness, yes. Well, maybe not the last part. I forgot my password or kind of locked myself out. Maybe I have. You know, I've lived with systems that, 3 times and you're out. You've got to go see the system administrator. You're kind of, it's that moment of embarrassment and shame. But I had my identity stolen. Someone has filed my taxes as recently as this year. I'm given the publicly available information. And so the question is, am I prepared for that? Do I have some degree of kind of fire gap, between that event and the rest of my financial portfolio? I do, right? I've learned the lessons of those things will happen. And so can you identify it at the earliest possible moment? Can you stop it in its progress? And can you protect the rest of what they've not yet got access to? None of us is inured or safe from this. We're all in the same kind of bucket. And the question is, are you vigilant enough to determine that something is going on that you should engage at the earliest possible moment with the highest possible leverage? And do you have a coalition, right, that you can bring to bear such that whatever's holding you at risk, they got to beat all of you. They got to beat all of us in order to beat the one of us that they're after. I think that's actually the lesson that I've learned over time. And I try to practice that, maybe not perfectly, but ruthlessly day after day.
Well, the fact you had a wake-up call is quite a wake-up call for me, too.
Well, you haven't lived until you try to file your taxes with the federal authorities within the United States, and they said, that's a problem because you already have.
Oh, right? Yeah, so I hope I never come across that. Chris Inglis, thank you, sir, for your time.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Well, there's a lesson for us all. If America's former cyber czar can get hacked, we all need to be taking cybersecurity seriously. Well, my next guest is Dr. Richard Stainings, a cybersecurity strategist who's become one of the go-to experts when healthcare systems are threatened. And that includes major data breaches of medical records, hacking digital devices such as pacemakers, and even bringing down entire healthcare networks. Professor Richard Stainings, great to have some time with you, sir.
Hi there.
Now, I wonder, what sort of risks in particular do you feel the healthcare environment faces when it comes to cybersecurity? What are the key ones?
There are many risks across cybersecurity. Lack of funding results in an under-provision of cybersecurity services. Lack of prioritization results in the delay of cybersecurity policies, procedures, controls. And of course, cybersecurity is being impacted by the dramatic change of digital health, right? There is a huge transformation going on within the healthcare industry right now. The inclusion of a multitude of new IoT devices, for example. Artificial intelligence is playing a big part in healthcare moving forward. And these present an expanded risk profile for the industry.
And I'm going to go into those in a bit of detail. You have a lot of experience in this sector, and I wonder from your own perspective, what is your personal worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is that equipment in a hospital is compromised and used to assassinate a patient, right? That's an extreme risk scenario, and I don't really want to scare anyone who's watching this to think that that might happen in the immediate future, but potentially we have to look at attack vectors within the healthcare sector to understand what perpetrators may decide to do. And it's not just the monetization of stolen intellectual property that is driving cybercriminal activity. We, of course, have heightened geopolitical tensions today, and who's to say what some actor may decide to do in the future.
In doing my research, I think one of the things that struck me the most and was quite terrifying was how a few years ago the FDA in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, recalled devices, pacemakers. It sounds strange to recall a pacemaker because they were vulnerable to cyber attacks. So it makes me wonder, how much of a threat is that in this day and age?
It's a very real threat. Unfortunately, most of our medical devices that are in use, whether they're embedded, like a pacemaker or an infusion pump for insulin, for example, or whether they're a large-scale medical device that we use to scan a patient, an X-ray or CT or PET or ultrasound system, for example, or a patient telemetry monitoring system, right? These are all systems that were designed for medical or clinical functionality. They weren't designed with security in mind, and it's only recently, thanks to FDA regulation change last year, that we've begun to see security designed in from the outset, and also medical device manufacturers being held liable to maintain the security of those devices. By that I mean conduct vulnerability assessments, make those vulnerability disclosures available rather than hide them, which has happened in the past, and to release patches in a timely manner so that systems can be updated and upgraded. The problem is the number of legacy medical devices. There are literally millions of medical devices that will be with us for the next 20 years. And those are not subject to the FDA rules. So we have a bit of a gap, as it were, in terms of how do we go about securing those devices.
Who could have imagined in the Internet of Things, as we call it, that includes now people, people having devices in their bodies, even that could be vulnerable. And I guess as technology advances, we're going to have more and more cyber parts, if you want to put it that way, which are going to be even more vulnerable to attacks. So this is a serious concern. It's
very much a serious concern, and you've only got to look at the growth of consumer medical wearables, right? We all walk around with an Apple Watch on our hands, or a Fitbit, or some other device that is tracking our level of physical activity. It's tracking our calorific intake if we program that into, or we enter that data into the system, and that is then being communicated via an mHealth app, right, a mobile health app, to our medical record in many countries. And Australia, as an example, has opened up My Health Record, which is their national health record, to include consumer medical data, so that data that a person generates as a result of their activity is now being entered into their electronic patient record.
Now, one thing that surprised me a lot when you and I had a chat prior to this interview was when you told me that the healthcare systems that generate more data, far more data, than all other sectors combined. That just sounds staggering.
Yeah, it is. And the lakes of data should probably not be referred to as lakes anymore. They're more like oceans of data, right? Medical activity creates a massive amount of data. And of clinical treatments, of patient outcomes, all of this sort of data. And that data is extremely valuable to the medical profession in terms of being able to mine that data for AI, for example, for clinical decision support being a classic example, and various other forms of data. But there's also a huge concern with all of that data being generated. How do we go about protecting that data so that it doesn't enter, the public realm or is not stolen by criminals?
Yeah, that was interesting to me, that there have been some really high-profile healthcare breaches affecting tens of millions of people. It was really quite shocking when I did my research. And this concept of medical identity theft was something that surprised me. What is the consequence of such attacks, cyber attacks, for individuals?
So we have seen the increasing level of sophistication of cyber attacks against the healthcare industry over the past decade, right? It used to be that a perpetrator would or a group would infiltrate a hospital system, steal medical records, and then sell those medical records. We're now seeing the industrialization of that criminal activity, so that data is passed out and sold on to other groups. So, for example, personally identifiable information is sold on to identity theft rings, right? Medical data is sold to other groups that may be able to exploit that. Medical insurance data is sold to medical insurance rings, and of course intellectual property is sold to the highest bidder. Right?
Richard, I can understand people wanting credit card details and things like this for identity theft, but what would they do with the medical information? I mean, where is it valuable to the thieves?
So the first thing is that if you or I were to have our credit card stolen, right, there is a very short lifespan for the criminals to use that particular data, right? Before we recognize that there's something going on with our account, we call our bank and we cancel the card and they issue us a new one, right? And it's in the mail within a couple of days. An inconvenience to us, but the banks are insured against criminal use, and they have anti-fraud systems and can detect nefarious activity very, very quickly. Now, a medical identity has a much, much longer lifespan. So if, for example, I, as a child, had my medical record stolen, I might not realize that until much, much later on in life, right? That information might not need to be exploited straight away. So I could have I could be involved in a hospital data theft, right? Or my identity could be involved in a hospital data theft, and the perpetrators of that crime would have years to exploit it.
So I could see that the people are scared to give out the medical information or have it out there because, for example, trying to get insurance, if the insurance company knows there are certain vulnerabilities a person has, their insurance premium might go up. But in terms of the thieves, what they could do with it, what are the most nefarious kind of uses?
Well, I suppose the most obvious is ransomware, right? It's taking that information, encrypting it to make it unreadable or unavailable, right? And then ransoming that back either to the provider of the healthcare services, the hospital system, or what we're seeing now, secondary and tertiary ransom attacks against individuals, either to persuade those individuals to contact their provider to pay a ransom to the criminals, or directly to pay a ransom to the criminals themselves so that their data is not published or their data can be unencrypted and available for them to use.
What do you believe are the most valuable lessons learned from these major breaches?
I think there are a number of lessons that can be learned. Firstly, criminals are very adept at changing their attack vectors, right? They're very creative in terms of how they exploit data once they've got hold of it, and it's a continuously moving target. And I think that represents some interesting lessons for cybersecurity professionals like myself and others, obviously, about how adept we need to be in terms of our cybersecurity defensive strategies, what tools, what people, what processes we need to bring to bear, and how we really need to prioritize cybersecurity of the healthcare industry given the state of play of the criminal attackers today.
As someone who goes and advises healthcare systems about cybersecurity, how receptive have you found them to be?
I think there's a new openness. A decade ago, I would have these conversations with ministers of health or leaders of healthcare systems around the world, and there was a certain degree of it'll never happen to us, a certain thought that would be the case. I think today there's a realization, a stark realization, that an attack is not only an inevitability, but it's just a question of time. How long and how bad will that attack be? So therefore, leaders of healthcare systems are reconsidering the prioritization of cybersecurity controls in order to protect this critical national asset.
No matter how much advice you give, the weakest link is always the human. So where does the factor of advising individuals come in?
So security education, training and awareness is probably the single biggest bang for buck for any cybersecurity professional in any profession. 97% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing attempt, right? So if we can present some level of due diligence through training in our staff, then we've, by a large shot, reduced the threat surface to the hospital because all of our staff are working in a single unified manner to ensure patient safety.
Now, are you optimistic that the battle against cyber attacks is being won, or is there such an evolution in the nature of these cyber attacks that we will never be safe?
It's a very good question. I think that the goalposts are moving all the time, right? This is something that is not going to be easily won, a battle that's not going to be easily won. Cyber criminals are highly inventive, and they're always coming up with new attack vectors that they can infiltrate our health data and our health IT systems, for example. The big concern is that we need to mirror those changes, right, in our defense posture in order to protect hospitals, their data, their systems, and obviously patient safety from these sorts of attacks.
Such a worrying term, attack vectors. Professor Richard Stanings, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Interpol is the world's largest police force. Formed in the aftermath of the First World War, it was established to combat an increasing threat from international crime. Collaboration between countries allowed crime fighting to extend beyond national boundaries. And today, the organization has almost 200 member countries. When it comes to fighting cybercrime, that original principle of collaboration is more important than ever. I met with Dr. Neil Jaton, Interpol's Director of Cybercrime, for an insight into the agency's battle against the hackers. Dr. Jaton, great to have some time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you know, there's this romantic image of what Interpol is. It's like that kind of agents in coffee shops in romantic places like Rome and Paris having secret meetings. It's like the CIA, MI6, I guess. How real is that?
It's spot on. It's exactly like that. No, it's not really like that. But I don't know what a lot of agencies, you have this romantic feeling for it, and then about what you think in your head, what it's going to be, and then you come in to an agency. So I've been here for 2 months, and I didn't really have too many preconceived notions because I've been a federal agent for a long time. So I've kind of been in this space. But I will say that it has been an amazing experience just for the 2 months. And I think the strength of Interpol and the strength of my team within the Cybercrime Directorate is having, there's only roughly 40 to 50 people. There are only 2 Americans. So you're looking at a wide array of cultures and people and bringing all sorts of strengths from their walks of life.
Tell me what your son said when you said you're joining Interpol.
Yeah. Well, my son was very excited. We were actually watching an action movie at that time when so I was living in D.C., and he was like, oh, like that, like James Bond. And I said, no, not exactly. And I explained kind of what I was doing, and he was less than impressed with me. But he was also kind of aware of the romantic notions of, being a federal agent and how that is. And he was like, yeah, you're still just dad,
And I guess the cybercrime area on which you focus, you head, is even more that kind of ethereal area.
I mean, it's so emerging and evolving. It is very, very tough. And I don't think when you come into law enforcement, I don't think most people, maybe nowadays, but when I came in 15 years ago, it wasn't to do cyber crimes or crimes, involving computers. You wanted to knock down doors. You wanted to put people behind, bars. You wanted to really be high speed. And I think nowadays the crime, you can almost just get rid of the word cyber and just call it crime, because there's not a lot of crime that's really not connected now to a computer, to a phone, or some other network system. You really see that. So I do think that as you progress through your career, you may have come in saying, I want to combat this type of crime, but it's very clear that you're going to have some sort of cyber background to be successful.
And yet the Hollywood image is that cyber criminals have the chance to take down entire systems. Airports can be shut down, traffic lights can be changed, right. Like the Die Hard 4 kind of thing. Any reality in that?
I think everything's kind of based a little bit in reality, and then movies are, amplified to, a much higher magnitude. But can bad guys target critical infrastructure and be successful? Sure. You looked at the Colonial Pipeline incident in 2021, the U.S.'s largest fuel pipeline, and what the bad guys were able to do was go through the billing system. And you would think that something maybe as innocuous as that wouldn't have such detrimental effects, but it did. The Colonial Pipeline had to shut down the entire company to contain the breach. Large lines at the pump, concern about fuel availability. So it is a reality, but it's not all doom and gloom. I will say that every day we have these sort of conferences where we come together. We talk about how do we improve cybersecurity. So I think we're making great strides.
How did you react when the Crowdstrike incident happened? It was faulty software, so it wasn't really malicious, but I think it exposed a lot of vulnerabilities.
So for us, we are not in the critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, vulnerability business necessarily. We're in the law enforcement business. For any sort of incident, whether it's a CrowdStrike, that wasn't quite, malicious, through something that is, we really are dependent on the member countries' law enforcement to reach out to us for assistance. Or in some cases, maybe we'll have some intelligence through some partners that we're able to push out.
The interesting thing about that incident, though, was that it opened the door for criminals to bounce in quickly.
That's right. They're always looking. And so, again, I think you have all these national security agencies working diligently trying to identify these vulnerabilities to make it much more difficult for hackers.
It does suggest, though, that the fact they can react quickly to what was not a malicious attack and get their malicious attack in, that they're quite ahead of the game.
I do think it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. I think that the incentive for the bad guys is financial, so that when you are really focused on making a buck, this is how you earn your living. Of course, you're going to be very, very aggressive in identifying these threats. But I will say that law enforcement, Interpol, is forward-looking, looking at emerging technology, looking at the emerging threats, and trying and try to stay right with the criminals.
As director of cybercrime at Interpol, of course, you get to see the extremes, how bad things could be.
Right.
How worried should we be as citizens?
No, I think you should be concerned. I mean, obviously with emerging technology, but AI, quantum computing, those are obviously some issues. But just as being a parent of a child who I'm finally allowing to have a smartphone for the first time as a teenager, we have had to have sit-down conversations with them about the threats. And I'm like, your dad is the director, Interpol, cybercrime director at Interpol. You cannot be doing these things. No, you cannot have this app. You're too young. But I'll just say that I think schools are doing a much better job of understanding the issues as well. Parents should take some responsibility, on themselves too.
For many of us, Hollywood is that lens, and cybercrime is seen as young people, sometimes in basements. They're doing things that from their homes, effectively.
Right, in their basements behind their keyboard.
Is it real?
Yeah, I'm assuming. Yeah, that is quite a bit. I mean, but also it runs the gamut. You may think like, oh, it's a 50-year-old. Grizzled, person just down in the basement. But no, as you see in some of these ransomware incidents, they're youth. They're not even of legal age, and they're causing this sort of mayhem. So yeah, it's just somebody being able to the ability to have that tech savviness and also the will to actually cause harm. We've seen criminals all ages.
Beyond these, institutions and documents that come out through the UN and so forth, in general, how well is the world keeping up with the threat of cybersecurity, on cybersecurity?
I think well. I mean, obviously, we're always going to. It's really, I think, country dependent. As Interpol, my goal is to bring up those that maybe not as cyber mature, to bring them up to a level so that they can defend themselves, defend their citizens. I do think it's improving.
And then you do need legislation, because one of the biggest frustrations in traditional crime is legal loopholes or the lack of legal infrastructure to be able to lock the bad guys away.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, Interpol is not here to tell a country what to do and how to legislate itself. But we do understand that the legality, the laws have to match the emerging crimes. And, in the U.S., they have the same issue. So that's really not something that we would directly say, person to person. What I would say, though, from any perspective, what I will say, and I'm not saying that government should make it mandatory, but if you are a victim of cybercrime, whether it's anything from being a business being attacked by ransomware or a child who's a victim of sexual exploitation, is to contact law enforcement. I know that sometimes it can be very, very difficult to make that because you're now suffering through the worst day of your life, and now you have to go talk to law enforcement about it. But if you really want to make I think, receive some justice and then help future victims, it is to, reach out to law enforcement.
Now, I know you don't tell governments how to legislate and so on, but I do wonder how much it impedes what you can do when it actually comes to enforcing what you're doing.
So for us, our enforcement is only through our member countries' law enforcement agencies. So it's really upon them. We'll provide them as much information, as much support as we can, and then it's on their individual governments what they do with the end of their legislation.
How, again, going to this idea that hackers can create widespread havoc, how much is this kind of DDoS, a term that's come into our vocabulary now, distributed denial of service, how much of a threat is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you see, so DDoS attacks, that's the slang for it, but
DDoS,
yeah, that's okay. So obviously it is a significant avenue of attack. But we, again, if a company or if a business or an entity is suffering from a DDoS attack or any sort of cyber attack, my point of view, and I think you would talk to anybody from law enforcement, is reach out to your local law enforcement, have them, and if they need support, then come to Interpol and Cybercrime Directorate, and we'll do more than anything that we can. We'll do anything that we can help.
Dr. Chetan, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? What eats up your time and resources?
Well, I would always say that funding and finding personnel. Interpol, we bring in seconded officers. So basically, like myself, I come from the U.S. My home agency pays for me. I am on loan to Interpol for a few years. So It's getting those agencies from all different countries, and we want a wide spectrum. I would have like somebody from every region to come in and be a part of our team. So it's finding, you know, the personnel, it's finding the funding for the different projects that we have. Those are the things that really take a lot of my time.
I guess the great thing about being such a diverse group of people at Interpol is that you do take back these skill sets with you and share them.
Yeah, that's the selling point. Like, we want your best and your brightest. You come to us because I know it's also a sort of a catch-22 when you send somebody who's so good, now they're not with you anymore in your home agency. So I understand that, but my hope is that when you come to us, when you leave in the 3 years, whether sometimes they're short-term secondments for a year, sometimes they're 3 years or extended, my hope is that when you go back, you use the skills that you develop, especially like the diplomacy skills, the ability to mediate, those sort of skills that you may not get as a police officer, as an agent. You take those skills back and enhance your agency.
You explained how this isn't really what you got into. You weren't really going into cybercrime,
right.
But of course everything's evolved and it's continually evolving. So is AI, artificial intelligence, your friend or enemy, for example?
No. I think any emerging technology, I'll just say, in my opinion, it's neutral. So it's whoever it's in the hands of, whatever the intent is, that's really whether it's good or bad. And so we understand the criminality, the uses of it, and criminals are always going to take advantage, whether it's AI, quantum computing. I mean, it was computers, 20 years ago, and smartphones and apps and all that. Whatever emerging crime, there's going to be some ingenious criminal who's going to try to find it and exploit it. So again, it's on us as law enforcement to be forward-looking, to say, hey, these are the emerging threats, and how can we combat that? And so within Interpol, we do have an innovation center that's also housed with Singapore that's looking at those very concerns.
This sounds like an echo of guns don't kill people,
yeah,
people kill
it's
people.
The same. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to compare one to the other, but again, it really is how you use it, because I think there's going to be some great uses with AI, obviously, and then obviously it's going to be some negatives.
I think the way I've heard you put it is that basically technology is agnostic.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
In terms of keeping up with everything, do you have the resources to be able to keep up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, could we always use more funding? Could we always use more personnel? Of course. I mean, any agency could. But what we should do, and I think in Cybercrime Directorate, is we should be more forward leaning and continued sustained communications with our 196 member countries to actually ask them, what do you need? Because we may think from Singapore, these are the cyber concerns that we think you should be concerned about, and yet it may not be. So that's part of my strategy, is to conduct outreach with those members to say, what exactly do you need from Interpol?
How do you regard the term cyber psychology, and how does that fit in with what you do?
For me, from a law enforcement perspective, what I want to always look at is when we go and interview a victim, whether the victim is a business, a hospital, and have to talk to the CISO who's now suffering through stress, and I'm not comparing them, or to talk to somebody who's been a victim of some sort of sexual exploitation, especially with children, is to understand that is their worst day. And so for law enforcement, I think our goal is always to get the evidence, to get the interview, and then go on and catch the bad guy and stop the next thing from happening. But I think from law enforcement, we have to take a step back and realize that these are some bad days, the worst days that these people are suffering through, to show them some grace, show them some kindness at the same time.
Technology is moving fast, but let me wrap up by asking you if you could paint me a picture of what the cybercrime scene might look like maybe a decade from now.
So, I mean, I wish I had a magic ball and I knew who to invest in, which companies were going to be a part. But obviously AI, I mean, that's the buzzword, AI. I think quantum, computing and the encryption that's going to, become problematic in the future. I think those are things that I'm sure criminals are already salivating at the thought of. I think that there are the law enforcement and other government agencies that are also looking at that and saying, no, we're going to be ready for this. We're going to, maybe not everything, but the focus isn't just going to be on for the criminals. We're actually going to concentrate on these things too. So I will just say, though, that Interpol has been in existence. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. So 1923 to 2023. And so in 10 years, I think the Interpol and Interpol's Cybercrime Directorate will still be combating, transnational cybercrime and still being a good partner to 196 member countries.
Dr. Neil Jaton, thank you very much. Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Let's continue that theme of cyber psychology with a woman whose work in the field inspired the hit TV crime drama CSI Cyber. In fact, her character is played by an Oscar-winning Hollywood actress. As many experts will tell you, humans are often regarded as the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Dr. Mary Aiken's work includes profiling hackers and identifying their vulnerabilities. But she's ready to back her own brain against AI any day. Dr. Mary Aiken, great to have a chance to chat with you because it's been fascinating to find out the kind of areas you cover. Now, I do want to start, though, with your role on CSI Cyber, how you've been portrayed there. Tell me about that.
Yes, actually, I was doing some work for the White House on tech solutions to human trafficking, and there was some publicity around it, and afterwards I got a call from William Morris, and I thought it was Philip Morris, the cigarette company, so I said, I don't do endorsements. Anyway, turned out to be an agency. They brought me to Hollywood. I met some people, and the next thing, they created a division of the show, CSI New York, CSI Miami, CSI Cyber, based on my work, and Patricia Arquette played me in the show.
That's pretty good. I was like, well, it's at least getting some visibility there as well. And I want to ask you, how much does a TV series like that actually portray the reality?
I think that, they're metaphors. So when we're talking about something in a television show, what we're trying to do is sort of provide explanatory value. We're trying to educate general population. So there's a famous scene that we did had this operator looking at code on the screen, and it was all green, and all of a sudden the malware showed up as red, and the operator said, oh, we've got malware. And of course the InfoSec community went crazy because they said, that's not how it works. Malware doesn't jump out as red code. But it was a metaphor that an experienced operator would see it as red code. Of course, there was all this trouble online about it and how we were dumbing down, computer science and InfoSec. And then the US Army cavalry came to my rescue in the form of West Point. And they wrote an article in defense of CSI Cyber saying how important it was. The series aired in 170 countries worldwide.
One thing is new to a lot of people is this term cyber psychology. Explain that in a simple way.
Cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. It's about 20 years old as a discipline, which is really young, and I'm one of the pioneers in the field. I'm a professor of cyber psychology in London, and I'm a professor of forensic cyber psychology in the US. Forensic cyber psychology is the study of criminal, deviant and abnormal behavior, and I'm kept pretty busy.
I'm sure. And I love the fact you're not scared to speak your mind, because I know you don't really like the term cyber resilience. Explain why.
Yes, so we're here at GCF, and we had a panel earlier today talking about cyber resilience, well, cognitive resilience particularly. And I suppose, as a cyber behavioral scientist, you often come across these terms, and my guess is, and yeah, I'm probably right, I'm sure it was a term invented by a computer scientist who said, well, we've got resilience in systems, and they can, be resilient during an attack, and then they can bounce back quickly afterwards. So let's retranspose that construct to humans, and then develop resilience in humans. My point is that, okay, if we're going to talk about resilience, let's talk about the psychology of resilience. So across the general population, if you had, say, 4 people in a family, there's a strong genetic component. One person will have no resilience, 2 of them will be 50-50 on resilience, and 1 will be extremely resilient. So I object to the term because where are we going with collective cybersecurity? Is it a Darwinian push towards survival of the tech fittest? That's not fair.
So really, that is an interesting thought, tech fittest or cyber fittest, in effect, someone who can handle that. Basically, that suggests it's not just a simple vertical silo. It's not something that can be handled in a simple way. It has to be a much broader understanding.
I think you've got to factor the human into the equation, and not in a sort of, scientific or computer science or infosec science way of sort of an approximation of what it is to be human. When we talk about protecting critical infrastructure, what is the most critical infrastructure that we're trying to protect? It's humans, us, our families, our communities, our cities, our nations. That's what we're trying to protect, is the humans.
From your research and all that you've seen in your studies, how much more vulnerable are we now? The fact we all have devices, young people have access to almost everything. You know, you say cyberpsychology, the impact of this technology on our minds, it must be pretty intense.
Well, when things go wrong, look, there are a lot of things that are great about tech. I was just asked earlier about internet addiction and how do I control my technology use. I'm probably the worst person. I'm a cyber psychologist. I spend a disproportionate amount of my time online. But the point is, in terms of you and I, we're sort of done, we're cooked. Like, not a lot is going to go wrong in terms of our neural activity and our use of technology. But the developing child, when I see 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds with mobile phone devices, when, millions of neurons are making connections, we have to think about that. There's a great paper by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Unknown. I worry about the unknown in terms of the impact of technology on the developing child.
How much real thought is being given to this right now? Because everyone seems to run at such a fast pace. Do people pay enough attention to this potential unknown?
I think that to a certain extent, parents have sort of given up. It's too much. They're trying to manage and juggle their busy lives. The kids seem happy on their devices. And there's not enough education and awareness raising about the impact of that technology in a good way, in terms of like enhancing fine motor skills and, the deficits associated with that and the problems associated with age-inappropriate use of technology. So I think we just have to be, we need, in the real world, we have ages of development. If you have children, you knew what age they should sit up and say their first words and take their first step. What's the equivalent in a cyber context in terms of ages of cyber development? And how do we inform parents about that?
Now, when people talk about cyber threats, cyber attacks and so on, I know you also have a very clear perspective on this because they do vary.
Yes, again, we were discussing earlier and somebody was saying, a cyber attack is a major event and then everything else should be considered a cyber incident. I don't agree with that. If somebody broke into your home and hit you over the head and went upstairs and pulled up your mattress and took, your savings, $10,000 from under your bed, that's an attack. When somebody is targeted online in terms of cyber fraud or extortion in terms of an investment that goes wrong, which is, cyber fraudulent investment, and somebody loses their life's savings and they're humiliated and incredibly depressed as a result, that's an attack. If a young boy is coerced into a relationship online and then sextorted as a result, that's an attack. If a small business is held to ransom and people lose their livelihood in terms of a ransomware attack, that's not an incident. That is an attack.
How do you regard disinformation and deep fakes and fake news? What sort of attack do they present then?
I think disinformation, and we've seen in the UK recently how disinformation online can lead to public disorder. And, there's a symbiotic relationship between cyberspace and the real world. What happens in cyberspace impacts the real world. What happens in the real world impacts cyberspace. So when you get this massive amounts of mis and disinformation online, it can lead to public order incidents. I mean, we saw that with the March on Capitol Hill in the US. And mis and disinformation, the potential impact in terms of elections. Mis and disinformation for young people. There was a recent piece of research, and something like 60% of young people thought that mainstream media was disinformation, fake news. So how are we going to maintain social order and civil society when people can no longer trust sources?
You're a pioneer in cyber psychology, and AI has come in now. Everything's moving so fast. How hard is it for you to keep up, and what impact is AI going to have?
Oh, I can beat AI any day, hands down. I mean, I've got a 1,000,000-year-old piece of technology that's been in development for 1,000,000 years, the human brain. On any given day, that is going to beat AI. AI, we mistake it as human intelligence because it can do some things incredibly quickly. That's not intelligence. That's just a task. That's like sweeping versus using a hoover. You know, it's not intelligence. As a behavioral scientist, I can categorically say that we barely understand how the human brain works. To create something that replicates something we don't understand, it's a false premise. So I think what we have to do is look at not AI replacing humans, but IA, intelligence augmentation, the work of Licklider, who wrote in 1950 about man-computer symbiosis, that symbiotic relationship between man and machine, placing the human at the center of the decision-making process.
Let's end with perhaps 3 bullet point pieces of advice to people on how they can build their sense of strength against this, how they can, if you like, manage their cyber psychology.
I think the first thing that people need to do is understand the potential impact of technology on their lives. The second thing they've got to do is educate themselves about what the possibilities are and what strategies they could deploy. And then the third strategy is actually deploy. Do it. Just do it.
Dr. Mary Aiken, what a pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sound advice from cyber psychologist Dr. Mary Aiken. I leave you with one final thought. If you're hearing about cybersecurity for the first time, you might not know that the US has declared October to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Even more surprising is the fact that it first did so 20 years ago. The battle continues. And that's all for this edition of the show. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up in today's program, Khalil Hayya, the head of Hamas in Gaza, issues a statement confirming the killing of the leader Yahya Sinwar by Israeli forces. Israel releases drone footage of the final moments of Yahya Sinwar's life, just after he was killed yesterday in a military operation in Rafah. And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the conflict with Hamas will continue unless the group puts down its weapons. And the US President Joe Biden says it's time to move on after the death of the Hamas leader, adding that he's more hopeful about the prospects of a ceasefire now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. In a televised address, the head of Hamas, Khalil Hayya, has paid tribute to Yahya Sinwar, describing him as a fallen martyr. Well, the head of Hamas in Gaza went on to call Sinwar steadfast, brave and intrepid, stating that he sacrificed his life for the cause of our liberation.
We mourn the great leader, the martyred brother, Yahya Sinwar, Abu Ibrahim, Hamas political bureau chief and commander of the Al-Aqsa flood battle.
Well, this comes after Israel released a video from Israeli drone footage which shows the Hamas leader sitting in a bombed building before throwing a piece of wood at the drone. Well, after an Israeli operation in Rafah, which involved the storming of a building during routine searches for Hamas members, Sinwar was killed alongside 2 other men. Well, his body was later identified using DNA records, confirming his death in that raid. Well, Yahya Sinwar, who had long topped Israel's most wanted list, was considered a central figure in orchestrating the attacks that took place on the 7th of October. His role in coordinating Hamas's operations made him a critical target for Israeli forces. Well, despite this significant development, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has emphasized that Sinwar's death does not signal the conclusion of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Netanyahu reiterated that the conflict would persist until Hamas puts down its weapons.
While this is not the end of the war in Gaza, it's the beginning of the end. To the people of Gaza, I have a simple message. This war can end tomorrow. It can end if Hamas lays down its arms and returns our hostages.
The Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. Well, the head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, has also emphasized during his address that captives held in Gaza will not be released until Israel ceases its attacks and withdraws its forces from the besieged enclave. Welcome. In a televised address, the head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya, has paid tribute to Yahya Sinwar, describing him as, quote, a fallen martyr. Well, he went on to call Sinwar steadfast, brave and intrepid, stating that he'd sacrificed his life for, quote, the cause of our liberation.
We mourn the great leader, the martyred brother, Yahya Sinwar, Abu Ibrahim, Hamas political bureau chief and commander of the Al-Aqsa flood battle.
Well, this comes after Israel released a video from a drone which shows the Hamas leader sitting in a bombed building before throwing a piece of wood at the drone. Well, after an Israeli military operation in Rafah, which involved storming the building during a routine search for Hamas members, Sinwar was killed alongside two other men. Well, his body was later identified using DNA records confirming his death in that raid. Well, Yahya Sinwar, who had long topped Israel's most wanted list, was considered a central figure in orchestrating the attacks that took place on the 7th of October. Well, his role in coordinating Hamas's operations made him a critical target for Israeli forces. Well, despite this significant development, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emphasized that Sinwar's death does not signal the conclusion of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Netanyahu reiterated that the conflict would persist until Hamas puts down its weapons.
While this is not the end of the war in Gaza, it's the beginning of the end. To the people of Gaza, I have a simple message. This war can end tomorrow. It can end if Hamas lays down its arms and returns our hostages.
The Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. Well, the head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya, also emphasized during his address that captives being held in Gaza will not be released until Israel ceases its attacks and withdraws its forces from the besieged enclave. Well, for more reaction to the news of Yahya Sinwar's killing, I'm joined now by the head of the Palestinian mission to Denmark, Ambassador Manuel Hassassian. Thank you for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Let me start by asking you, what went through your mind yesterday when the news was confirmed that Yahya Sinwar was dead?
Well, actually, we were expecting this. It's not something new, because they assassinated Haniyeh, they assassinated Hassan Nasrallah. We knew that they would target Yahya Sinwar. And it was not really a strange feeling for me, because I knew that they were pursuing to assassinate him for a year now. But it happened that, Yahya Sinwar was a fighter and he died at the battlefield. So it's not orchestrated by the logistics of intelligence in trying to get him. It was sheer coincidence. And Netanyahu now is reaping the benefits that he killed, the guy who orchestrated the 7th of October, and they got rid of a terrorist, as he claims, as if there is no other Sinwars will come back and will be joining, and life goes on, as we say.
From what you're saying, Yahya Sinwar was far from being irreplaceable.
Well, I can say that he was a military strategist. He knew the mindsets of the Israelis. As you know, he was in prison for almost 24 years. And the guy was a graduate of Islamic University. So you're not talking about an ordinary guy. a guy with talents, with intelligence, and he managed militarily, strategically, to resist Israel's occupation in Gaza as much as he could. But unfortunately, I mean, things happen. Look, this is the end of him. But this doesn't mean that Hamas is finished. This doesn't mean that the problem in Gaza is finished. And this doesn't mean that that Sinwar is irreplaceable. No, he is replaceable.
But nevertheless, a serious blow to morale, I'd have thought, for not just the people of Gaza, the whole Hamas apparatus.
Yes, it was a blow, and I agree with you. As the death of Hassan Nasrallah was a blow to, to the Lebanese people in general, I would say. But in the final analysis, I mean, they do understand that, leaders are targeted for assassination. And Hezbollah, immediately they have a replacement. And they think that, they have to intensify, the resistance against Israel. And as you can see, that with the death of Nasrallah, we have seen Hezbollah to be more proactive, in terms of launching rockets to Israel. So things did not subside, and it did not really hit the morale where Hezbollah gave up its arms, basically. And let alone, I mean, if you look at Hamas, it's the same story. They will continue their resistance. They'll continue their fight. Their ideology is not going to be exterminated, by eliminating the militias of Hamas. Of course, Hamas also is getting severe blows from the Israelis. But this is life. This is resistance. We're not talking about state fighting another state. We're talking about non-state actors in politics, and these non-state actors in politics have taken, arms against their occupiers, and they think this is legitimate. And whoever joins them is a jihadist, and those who don't join them, basically, they are considered to be defeatists. So there is no a gray area here.
Right, and then just, I'm aware that you never actually met Yahya Sinwar, but I wanted to ask you what sort of a reputation he had as a person amongst people you knew in the world of Palestinian politics and amongst the Palestinian people.
Well, actually, they look at him as a hero, as a daring person, intelligent. His heart is for Palestine. He was committed through his own ideology that, fighting and resisting occupation is something sacred. He was liked by the militants of Hamas because he was a military strategist with them. And in general, I think the population, I can't tell because there's no still... survey of public opinion. But of course, those fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists in Gaza, are of course pro-Sinwar, and they think they have lost a great leader.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the legacy of Yahya Sinwar and how it's going to change now as a result of how he died, because it's very far removed from the picture that was painted of him by some in Israel who said that whilst young people were being killed on the battlefield, Hamas leadership like Yahya Sinwar were hiding in bunkers. And this turned out not to be the case at all. And I'm wondering whether, and I'm putting this question to other people that we speak to today in this program, has Israel inadvertently created something of a legend out of him?
I think so. They put the onus on Yahya Sinwar as being, the architect of October 7th attacks. And they believe that Yahya Sinwar understands the Jewish mentality very well, and he speaks Hebrew very well, and he could understand the mindsets of the Israelis. And that's why, as a character, he knew exactly how the Israelis think strategically and tactfully. And that's why, Netanyahu put the onus on Yahya Sinwar and made him also a leader, by by shouldering him the responsibility of 7th of October and making him the arch enemy of Israel.
Do you see some of what's being described by Western leaders, the President of the United States, the leaders of a number of European countries, this as being an opportunity for not just Gaza, but all the Palestinian people? Do you think the word opportunity is an appropriate word for us to be using at this stage?
The word opportunity is far from reality. We don't see it on the ground. We only listen to certain statements that come out from, presidents and what have you, because my perception that these are hollow words that have no concrete action on the ground. And if we look at opportunities, we don't know who is going to be after Sinwar, who is going to be the leader, who is to conduct the negotiations with the Israelis on the release of the hostages. We don't know. And now it's much more complicated because there is no negotiations and there is no leader from the other side, which is Hamas. And I don't see that window of opportunity unless we have someone who is flexible enough from Hamas to stop the war and to have humanitarian as a precondition to accepting to the release of the hostages. Without that, nothing is going to happen. So we have to wait and see. And let's not build our expectations too high by the killing of Sinwar, because things now are getting more serious. And I think it is chaotic now, because between the Hamas leaders inside and the Hamas leaders outside, that they need to have a replacement immediately on the battlefield. And that in itself will take some time for that person to go back to the issue of the hostages as a second priority, not as a first priority when it comes to him as a leader in Gaza.
And you wouldn't hold out much hope, therefore, that when you heard President Biden saying that his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, would be going back to the region to talk diplomacy, you don't sound like you're particularly optimistic that, given that this isn't the great opportunity it's being described as, that he's going to achieve very much during that visit.
I don't think he will achieve much from that visit. And as long as Hamas is in shambles now, I would say, for the time being, and nothing is going to be done. And the only trump card that Hamas has is the hostages. Besides that, their stamina, their ammunition has been depleted, and more and more. So Hamas is in a state, I would say, of really recollecting itself and trying to put a new strategy of how to take this over. And besides the political faction within Hamas that will deal with the negotiations on the hostages. Maybe Blinken is meeting, what's his name? Netanyahu. And he's not, is he going to meet with Hamas? No, he's going to meet with Netanyahu. He's going to meet with the Egyptian leader, Sisi, president. I don't think he's coming to Ramallah to meet our President Abbas. So, what is the purpose of this visit? Is Israel willing to withdraw from Gaza and accept the release of hostages without putting conditions on Hamas and go back to October 6th? I think things will be easier. Now, it's a matter of Palestinian issue. How to conduct and try basically to work out the national reconstruction of Gaza. It has to be an internal issue between the Palestinian Authority and that of Hamas. And I think Hamas reached a point where it would like to be part of the PLO, which means that they will be under the umbrella of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that is headed by President Mahmoud Abbas. In other words, the salvation for Hamas to the process of being part and parcel of the PLO will help Hamas to stay, but they wouldn't have the power to re-control Gaza or to be in charge of Gaza on civil and other issues. So that's for, if something is going to happen, I think, Blinken should push in his process, President Abbas, to be part and parcel of reconstructing Gaza, because President Abbas represents Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And then we talk about legitimacy, and then we talk about, the world community. We talk about international organizations being part and parcel of the national reconstruction and the infrastructure of Gaza, let alone some Arab countries will contribute, to the national reconstruction of Gaza. And that's the way we go further. And then we talk about legitimacy, and the legitimacy is President Abbas and the PLO.
Yes,
and
but does Hamas pay attention to the Palestinian authorities? Do you have lines of communication, and do you get the impression that there is a way to influence Hamas in a positive way? Is that something you think the Palestinian authorities can do? And if so, why are they not doing more of it?
We are doing as much as we can. Our president is trying, diligently to do that, and he has managed to reach a point where Hamas now wants to be part of the PLO, and that's the greatest achievement. Once they are part of the PLO, they are under the rubric of President Mahmoud Abbas and the PLO. Who did the negotiations with Israel in Oslo? It was the PLO. So the legitimacy of the PLO in controlling via the Palestinian Authority, Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem is a legitimate authority to continue with the issue of the two-state solution. If we don't do that, then what are we talking about? Where is peace? Where is security? Not only to Palestine, to the Middle East at large. The fulcrum of this today in the Middle East, the problem in the Middle East basically is the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Once we solve that, then the stability and security of the region will pave the way for a reconstruction, and elections will take place, within the presidential and that of the parliament, our parliament, the legislative council. And then we talk about a fresh new era. And the Israelis have to help us in conducting these elections, because they are prohibiting us to using it in East Jerusalem. And that's why we didn't have elections for almost 15 years now.
Sure. I mean, speaking of elections, there is an election in the United States in just a couple of weeks from now. And what's certain is there are less than 3 months to go before the Biden administration is over and a new page is turned. Are you seeing any opportunities there? Because some people we speak to say that the end of presidential terms in the United States can actually be quite productive, in particular with regards to this issue, the Middle East peace issue. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me tell you something. I go back when Clinton, 6 months before, exiting the presidency, he tried to pull out Camp David. It was not well prepared on both sides. He just rushed it. He wanted to have, an agreement as an exit president in order to have this honor that he has achieved peace in the Middle East. The same story goes now to Biden. Look, Biden in the beginning, in the middle, in the end, he's still sending military arms basically to Israel to annihilate the Palestinian people, in Gaza. Now, because he's exiting, he wants to be the emblem of peace and security in the Middle East by stopping the war and having, humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza. And so far, he could not influence Netanyahu to stop and have an armistice for at least a week for people, not to die from hunger and famine as they are doing now in Gaza, and the world is watching them dying from hunger and famine. And now, you know, after this opportunity of the killing of Sinwar, now Biden and Kamala Harris, you know, they want to straighten the records that they are for peace and stability and that they want to help the Palestinians while they are arming Israel up to its teeth. So this is the oxymoron of the situation. This is how I see the American policy. It is so sad that they have never been honest with their policies when it comes to Palestinians. And in the negotiations, they always supported the top dog, which is Israel, over the underdog, the Palestinians. And they have never changed their policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So why should we trust them now, during the 3 months, that they will really put action on Netanyahu to stop the war? I don't think Netanyahu will stop the war. After November 5, when he sees what the results are, he will reconsider the situation. That's how I see it. And I see that he likes to see Trump winning the elections because Trump unequivocally is on the side of Netanyahu. The others also were on the side of Netanyahu, but at least Trump will be straightforward to tell the Arab in Michigan, the citizens and the Arab world, that Israel is a country, has to survive. And as he said, it's a little tiny country, you know, they want to take it, you know, the Arabs and the Palestinians. It's a tiny country. Why don't they leave it for Israel and let the Arabs leave the Palestinians to live in Arab countries? This is a president who is running for elections, and he's saying this. So by de facto, I mean, what impressions the Palestinian Authority will have if this guy wins the elections, let alone the Palestinian citizen in America, when they hear such statements, will they vote for him? I guess not.
Ambassador, we're coming to the end of this interview. I just want to put one last thought to you. And let's sort of try to be a bit more optimistic about what can be done in the immediate future to bring about some sort of a solution here. Why doesn't the Palestinian authorities try to broker, and maybe you can tell me this has already been happening, broker a hostage release deal with the very clear message that returning the hostages who've been held under appalling conditions for more than a year now in Gaza, they go back to Israel, and the suffering for the Palestinian people in Gaza comes to an end, food and supplies are returned, the reconstruction process begins. That somehow package that up into an offer that is impossible to refuse. Isn't that a role that the Palestinian authorities can play as brokers in chief?
Well, actually, the Palestinian Authority has been since day one. I mean, our president, the Foreign Office in Palestine, have been, you know, diligently working with the international community on bilateral relations in international organizations to stop this carnage of war, this onslaught on the Palestinians in Gaza, and have humanitarian assistance and put pressure on Israel to stop the war. Once the war is stopped, there would be negotiations between the two parties, Hamas and that of Israel, to release the hostages. Hamas is willing to release the hostages, but not at any cost. The Israelis are putting impediments and conditions, and the war is continuing, and they are killing every day, and they want the release of the hostages without any return. How could this happen? Even our president, if he talks about it, he cannot broker such a deal, which the Israelis want, at the expense of being, you know, the top dog, you know, in this war. So it's not going to work out. Israel has to understand, in any negotiations, you put your maximalist position, but you end up with your optimum. And that optimum goes also to Hamas, where there will be an agreement with no expectations of achieving everything, but at least reaching a compromise. And that compromise would be the cessation of war, in return, the release of hostages.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Ambassador Manuel Hassassian, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by Yossi Beilin, who has held multiple ministerial and leadership positions in the Israeli government, amongst the Minister of Justice, Minister of the Economy, and Deputy Foreign Minister. Dr. Beilin, thank you very much for speaking to us. You, of course, played an important role in the peace process, notably with the Oslo Accords of 1993. Let me just start by asking you about the death of Yahya Sinwar. Does this represent, do you think, an opportunity for the page to be turned on what's been a year-long chapter of unspeakable horror in Gaza?
My clear answer is yes. When I initiated the Oslo process at the end of 92, my main reason for that was the increasing power of Hamas in the Palestinian state, in the Palestinian street. It was seen as much less corrupt than the PLO, intended to help the people, genuine, young, and people, even non-religious people, tended to support Hamas. I understood that this was a movement which totally negated any idea of peace with Israel, and just suggested to eradicate Israel, while the PLO, on the other hand, already recognized in '88, even if it is indirectly, the state of Israel and readiness to partition the land. And I think that Hamas remained a huge impediment on the way for peace. And if today, as a result of the killing the leader the other day, it is much weaker, I think that it is good news for those who believe in peace in the Middle East.
Sure. I mean, President Biden called Yahya Sinwar an insurmountable obstacle. And as we've been saying, that obstacle no longer exists. But let's be clear, he wasn't the only obstacle, was he?
Well, on all sides, there were mistakes, and there were people who were against peace, and there was violent and whatever. But he brought it to an extreme. I mean, what happened on October the 7th last year was impossible to describe. I mean, a human being cannot even apprehend the cruelty of his plan and the implementation of this plan. And his rejection of any peace agreement with Israel was total. On the other side, even if there were people who prefer not to have peace with the Palestinians, it is impossible to compare it to the behavior of Hamas. But it is true that he was not the only one. He was a very major one.
Lots of world leaders using this word opportunity, and that's the word that I started with as well when talking to you. We've heard that word used by the Vice President and presidential candidate Kamala Harris in the United States, world leaders from Italy, France, Germany, the UK and the European Union using similar language. Do you think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is feeling this international pressure to end the war in Gaza and realize this opportunity, or do you think he just disregards it?
Well, ending the war in Gaza is connected to the two-state solution because what has to happen is the total release of the hostages by Hamas, withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip, and inviting through the PLO a group of Arab states to put a foot on the ground and to take upon itself the management of Gaza for an interim period, like a year or 2 years or something like that. But those Arab states will not come to Gaza if there is no political horizon. And the political horizon is negotiations on the two-state solution. Now, this is the point. I think that on the one hand, the Americans should try to convince the Arab side speaking about indirectly Hamas, to release all the hostages, and the Israeli side to agree to the solution which is accepted by the whole world. I believe personally that it should be under an umbrella of an Israeli-Palestinian confederation. But at the end of the day, it is two-state solution. And since Netanyahu himself supported even the Trump plan 4 years ago, there is no reason that he should be the one who rejects it. There are others on his government, and they may leave the government if he accepts it, but then he should be assured that the opposition will support him if he is losing his majority in order to get to the two-state solution.
It sounds like, listening to what Netanyahu has said in the last 24 hours, like he'd agree with a lot of what you just said, but he'd say, not yet. He said, this is not the end of the war, but the beginning of the end. It sounds like now, in his opinion, is not the right moment for peace, because, you know, there has been this momentum that Israel has been experiencing lately, in particular with regards to degrading hostile forces in the region like Hezbollah, now Hamas, and others as well. Do you agree with Netanyahu that the war should carry on? We shouldn't, you know, the violence should not come to an end yet. It should carry on until such time as, you know, all sides are ready, and that isn't right now.
It's long overdue. We never had such a long war. We shouldn't have such a long war. I don't understand exactly what was the reason why Netanyahu continued and dragged it until now, and still speaking about continuing it. I mean, the price that all of us in the region are paying for this is crazy. We should not do that. We should stop it or end it now. And if you speak about now is not the time, you know, usually peace is signed by enemies. And I'm not saying that the Palestinian Authority is our enemy, it is our past enemy, and we are not going to make peace with Hamas because both sides are not ready for that. But the situation of war is usually leading people to say, okay, enough is enough, let's make peace, and the history is full of such examples. So, true, there is hatred, even increased because of what happened in the last year, but strangely enough, the need for peace is bigger, and I believe that if you have leaders on both sides, and if you have third parties who might push for that, it is not just pie in the sky.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of people have told this channel, we've been speaking to them, interviewing them from Israel and other parts of the world, who've said to us that they believe Prime Minister Netanyahu wants the war to carry on for as long as possible because it's directly linked to his own political survival. And the minute the war stops, he will have to face the music in terms of various legal setbacks and issues that he faces. Do you buy into that?
You know, the fact that it made an ongoing war may, and I don't know how, play into his hands doesn't mean necessarily that he planned it so. I am not sure. I'm not sure that it is right. I'm not sure whether it is wrong. What I'm sure today is that we need a third party, something which we did not need in the Oslo years, but that was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. Today, we need a third party. The third party is there, and if you speak about the UAE, if you're speaking about Egypt, if you are speaking about other Arab countries, and of course the United States, and with them, we should move.
What about China?
I'm not sure whether they are there, and I'm not sure whether both parties see them as, I would say, impartial. But if they they want it. You know, I went to China years ago and suggested to them to join the quartet with the UN, United States, EU, and Russia. And they said, no, we are not in a hurry to join something like that. And I'm not sure whether they changed their mind about it. Eventually, China is a very important country. And if it is ready to do something like this, I would not reject it up front.
I say China because China has been sharply critical of what's been happening in Gaza in recent weeks. They've expressed concern about the suffering of people there. Let me ask you this. Let's see the world through Benjamin Netanyahu's prism once again and try to work out what he needs to see in order to bring about an end to this war. What do you think he's waiting for? What do you think he wants to achieve before he's ready to sit down at a negotiating table and start talking about peace? Because we've had the death of Yahya Sinwar, the suffering of more than 1 million people in Gaza has been plain for everyone in the world to see. What else do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is waiting for?
I don't presume to know what are his thoughts. I know him quite well, many years. And still, I really don't know, by the way, if we are speaking about his trial, why does he really think, if he thinks so, that being a prime minister makes his situation better in front of the judges? But what I'm saying that since I'm not a psychologist, I don't know exactly what is moving him. What is important is that there will be factors in the surrounding which will come to him and say, hey, you can achieve A, B, C, D, including the enlargement of the Abraham Accord of more than 4 years ago, if you go for peace. And for him, I believe that the Abraham Accords are very, very important. And if he can enlarge it, maybe is a way to convince him to go for peace with the Palestinians. Because until recently, at least, he believed that he could make peace with all the Arab countries and without making peace with the Palestinians, and only then come to the Palestinians and say, now you have to do what I want you to do. That was stupid and wrong. And I hope that he understands it, because he is not stupid.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Yossi Beilin.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, let's get some more analysis now from the former special presidential envoy for the global coalition to ISIS and former deputy national security advisor, Ambassador James F. Jeffrey. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Ambassador Jeffrey. First of all, I'd just like to ask you for your reaction when you heard the news that Yahya Sinwar had been killed. What went through your mind?
First of all, how important that is. Nobody will regret his passing. He was a genius behind one of the most dramatic developments, certainly since 9/11 in the Middle East, which was the October 7th attack. And he has set into motion major changes in the region. I think on the whole, they'll turn out good, but they required his passing. This was critical both for the Israelis as a signal that they had achieved their key goals in Gaza, but also in terms of moving to a ceasefire, which is what President Biden is now pushing very hard for. Sinwar was a major obstacle. So for all of these reasons, I was particularly delighted, and I'm quite hopeful.
Yeah, indeed. President Biden called him an insurmountable obstacle, an obstacle that no longer exists. And he said there's much work to be done. Is your interpretation of the work that needs to be done specifically work oriented towards achieving a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, first of all, you can't separate a ceasefire from Gaza from everything else. In a nutshell, we have been in a conflict for over 20 years, mainly one side in the conflict, Iran, developing these proxies over 5 Arab states, state capture, development of missiles, a nuclear program. We've pushed back, but not very effectively. Ditto the Israelis and Arab states. But since the 7th of October, there's been a major counteroffensive, enthusiastically by Israel, unenthusiastically, but very effectively by the United States and other partners. And we're in a different situation where Iran has been knocked back on its heels for the first time in 20 years. So a Gaza ceasefire can further solidify this new Middle East. It can open the door to even closer relations between Arab states and Israel, particularly a Saudi-Israeli arrangement under the Abraham Accords. And it can further pressure Iran to rethink its entire Middle East program.
Just stay with us, Ambassador, because let's take a listen to what President Biden said when he received the news of the killing of Yahya Sinwar.
The death of the leader of Hamas represents a moment of justice. He had the blood of Americans and Israelis, Palestinians and Germans and so many others on his hands. I told the Prime Minister of Israel yesterday, let's also make this moment an opportunity to seek a path to peace, a better future in Gaza without Hamas.
Okay, that was President Biden speaking there, reacting to the news of the death of Yahya Sinwar. Ambassador Jeffrey, he talks about an opportunity. He talks about his conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you get the impression that there is will and desire on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu for now some kind of discussion oriented towards achieving peace and brokering a ceasefire?
That's still an open question. I would refer you to Thomas Friedman's 2 last pieces in the New York Times, including one today where he raises that, and he knows Netanyahu well. I know Netanyahu not quite as well, but more recently. He certainly is capable of doing this. At certain times, including before the 7th of October, in our talks with the Saudis, he indicated willingness to move forward on some kind of arrangement with the Palestinians as the price of diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. So he is capable of doing this. And the 3-step peace plan that President Biden announced at the end of May is actually an Israeli plan. And if whatever's left of Hamas agrees to a ceasefire, I'm pretty sure that the Israelis will go along with it, because at this point, the pressure to get the hostages back will be really insurmountable.
Yeah, I mean, what else is there? Obviously the hostages are very much everyone's focus, and that was one of the first issues to be raised after the killing of Yahya Sinwar was confirmed yesterday. The hostage groups in Israel demanding that something be done, more be done to bring about the freedom of their loved ones. But what else do you think, just trying to see the world through Benjamin Netanyahu's prism, what else does Israel need to achieve in order to bring about an end to the violence in Gaza?
Yeah, the objective Bibi Netanyahu, which he's been for most of his career, would look at it this way. One, he's achieved about as much as he can militarily in Gaza. 23 of the 24 Hamas battalions have been defeated. It has almost no offensive capability, and its lifeline under and through the border to Egypt has been cut. So if he can get a ceasefire, and as part of that, because that's the package, get the hostages back, B, and C, open the door to some kind of international presence. The Emiratis have put a proposal on the table. There's reports, including from Friedman and others, that Ron Dermer from the Israeli side, Netanyahu's closest advisor, Blinken's people, and others are talking about this. I and others from the outside have proposed a plan that is very similar to the Emirati plan. Others are working on things like this. So that's the C of the ABC, which is a day after in Gaza, that doesn't involve the Israelis. This is all feasible, but the devil is in the details. Hamas first has to agree to a ceasefire and the return of the hostages.
Yeah, Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, heading to Israel next week, heading to the region next week. We don't know exactly what's on his itinerary, but are you optimistic, given the backdrop and the difference in circumstances versus previous visits, and there have been more than a dozen visits during the last year, that actually Antony Blinken is going to return to Washington with something to show for it?
Well, the problem isn't Blinken's diplomatic skills. The problem is the wrong message. Blinken was carrying the message that characterized U.S. policy, and I was executing it in 3 administrations vis-a-vis Iran and its proxies since 20 years. And we continued after the 7th of October, including in Tony's visits, and the Israelis learned their lesson. And that message was, look, Iran and its surrogates aren't really a threat. They can be managed diplomatically. All you have to do is de-escalate, accept ceasefires, keep the region calm. It'll all be okay. I was on the phone with Rice when she passed that message on to the Israelis to stop the fighting in Lebanon in 2006. So Tony's been making this message, and the Israelis, I think correctly, have not been listening to him. Now it's a different message. It's going to be, okay, you have succeeded brilliantly in Gaza at great human cost, of course. You are doing very well with Hezbollah, and assuming that the next round of missile firings with Iran doesn't lead to a larger conflict, and I don't think it will, you've done well containing and deterring Iran. So it's time to move forward. Here is the peace plan. That's what that is a day after in Gaza, once there's a ceasefire in the Israeli military as part of that ceasefire, and that's an explicit part of it, Netanyahu has agreed to, withdraws. That's what Tony will be offering. That is something that the Israelis will at least listen to.
How optimistic, though, are you that they will act on that and not just listen to it?
Well, they will act on it only if Hamas accepts a ceasefire. If Hamas says we're not giving back the refugees, we're going to fight on forever, the Israelis, although I don't think that is the preference of most Israelis, and I don't think it's Netanyahu's preference, will stay in Gaza to continue to fight them. They have no choice. They can't abandon the place and leave whatever's left of the rubble in the hands of Hamas and the refugees there. In terms of accepting a day after, that involves what we and I think others are discussing, certainly the Emiratis, an international presence. Again, there's a lot of complications, particularly the role of the Palestinian Authority. And that would require a change in Netanyahu's position, but he's changed before. I think we're dealing with a different Middle East, a Middle East where Israel has brilliantly undermined what the New York Times reported a week ago was Sinwar's plan, coordinating with Hezbollah, Iran, and others, to launch a multi-front war against Israel. That whole concept, that whole threat that Israel has lived under for many years basically is gone.
Seen numerous administrations come and go in Washington. This is, of course, the final months of the Biden administration. And I'm just wondering whether perhaps during the final months of an administration, there is an opportunity, because that administration has nothing to lose and everything to gain in terms of its legacy, and in particular its foreign policy legacy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, it will depend to some degree on who wins in November. Because no administration, you're absolutely right, administrations are all about legacy at the very end, but no administration wants to see everything it does reversed. And while U.S. foreign policy tends to maintain, in the larger sense, the same deep characteristics, when presidents come in, particularly of another party, they tend to reverse whatever the last 6 things the last administration did, because they ran on these people were awful campaign. And this is characteristic of all, including Trump's campaign. So there is a risk of that. On the other hand, a new administration does not want problems. And the basic thrust of what Biden is trying to do is to expand on the Trump administration's Abraham Accords alliance of Israel, Arab states, and the United States against Iran. So it's not conceptually, it's not ideologically different from what Trump might want to do.
And just
obviously Harris will want to do it.
Sure. And this is my last question. I mean, the election is just a matter of weeks away. Whose chances do you rate better, having worked for both administrations, Republican and Democrat, over the years, and being a specialist on this region? Who do you think has got the upper hand when it comes to delivering results in the Middle East, the Republicans or the Democrats?
I'm not going to be political. I'll give you the strengths and weaknesses of both. To understand both Gaza and everything that's happened last year, and frankly, everything that's happened in the whole region, you have to look at the specific issues. In the case of Gaza, and a bit more broadly, it's Israel and the Palestinians, that struggle going back to 1948 and beyond. Then you have to look at the geostrategic big picture, which is Israel, Arab states, America, at times Turkey versus Iran and proxies. The Republicans are better at that latter. They're better at pushing back against Iran and proxies, particularly in the late Trump administration with the killing of Qasem Soleimani and certain other actions. The Democrats are better at the specifics, specifically finding a way forward between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But in either case, both are, the Democrats have learned a lesson that if you don't deal with Iran, Iran is going to deal with you. And the Republicans learned in the Trump administration, by explicit demand of the Emiratis, that you don't get Abraham's Accords progress between Israel and the Arab states, and thus the culmination of this plan, without concessions on the Palestinian issue by the Israelis. That was a demand the Emiratis made. The Israelis had to accept, and Washington went along with in the last administration. So I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic about continuity. I think it is the most likely, but not absolutely certain, outcome of this election.
All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador James F. Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get reaction now from people on the streets of Israel, Lebanon and Gaza to the news of Yahya Sinwar's death.
The leader, it's gone now, but this is not solve the problem. The problem now it's all the hostages that Hamas have in Gaza, and it's depend now in the Israeli government.
Yesterday, when the martyrdom of Sinwar was announced, it was a heavy blow to the Palestinian people. And Netanyahu was happy and will continue with the war rather than stop after Sinwar was targeted, allow the residents of northern and southern Gaza to return and end the war. No, he will continue.
This is a systematic plan. It's clear and obvious. When you come today and cut the head off a body, what are you doing? You're trying to eliminate the body by cutting off the head. But Israel doesn't know that if Sinwar is gone, there will be 1 million Sinwars. And if Haniyeh is gone, there will be 1 million Haniyehs. And if Hassan Nasrallah is martyred, we are all on his same path.
Well, for more on this, we can cross now to Florence in Italy and speak to the author and journalist Francesca Borri, who is a specialist on Middle Eastern affairs, who interviewed and spent time with Yahya Sinwar back in 2018, making for what was his first interview with a Western journalist. Francesca, thank you for speaking to us. Just tell us, how did you find out yesterday that Yahya Sinwar had been killed, and what went through your mind?
I expected it, actually. I was on the phone with one of the members of Hamas Politburo, and I got the picture that you have probably seen online, and I recognized immediately the watch. So before actually, Israel carried out the DNA test, the watch. Because, it was not a common model among Palestinians. And the watch, because Yahya Sinwar always said, it was not to forget the value of time. and because he already wasted too much of his life in prison. And of course, when he said prison, he didn't mean only the actual, prison in Israel, 27 years, but also Gaza. And so immediately, I noticed the watch, and I was sure that was, Yahya Sinwar. And I expected it because, the real turning point of this war was the death of Nasrallah, honestly. It became clear, that no one was going to join the war with Hamas, Hezbollah, or someone else. And I think that was the moment when Yahya Sinwar went out of the tunnels and decided to die the way he wished to die. Because honestly, the last image, when he throws a stick at a drone without a hand in his last moments, that's an iconic image that won't be understood in the West. I think it will be misunderstood in the West. But it means that Hamas, as we know it, is over. But at the same time, Hamas as an idea is more powerful than ever. So that's exactly what he was looking for.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're saying what a lot of people have told us, which is that Israel has created some legendary status, a legendary legacy for Yahya Sinwar through his death.
Absolutely. And I text Khaled Meshal today and I said, look, he was dead until yesterday and now he's alive again. Because after the death of Hassan Nasrallah, Palestinians honestly were furious with Hamas and also furious with Sinwar because, he really wanted to end the occupation. He really wanted to end the siege of Gaza. He was absolutely determined. And what he got? He ended Gaza, no? So when Nasrallah was killed, Palestinians were furious, especially because, no one in international media asked Palestinians, what do you think about, what's happening, International media, asked the opinion of Lebanese, of French, of Americans, of, Saudis, everybody, but not Palestinians, So the only achievement somehow of October 7th, Palestinians are against in the news. The Palestine question is again, a key issue of international politics, not even that. So Palestinians were furious. And now, after yesterday, even, Hamas enemies, even Palestinians who have always been, against Hamas, have to say, look at the way he died. Look at the way, he has been fighting until his last breath.
Let's talk, Francesca, a bit more about the time you spent with Yahya Sinwar. I mean, first of all, how long did you spend with him? Where exactly did you hold your conversations with him? And how did he come across to you? Was he a charming person?
In Gaza, first of all the time in Gaza, several times. And at the time, he was not famous, no? So I had nothing with me, as a journalist. I couldn't really prepare myself. I had only a picture of Yahya Sinwar, a picture that I found online in the Times of Israel. The usual picture of Sinwar is very aggressive, the typical picture of Western media and Israeli media. And so when he first entered the room, the first time, I was he was smiling and laughing, it was very funny, a funny man, and very average, always very, his main feature was not to have features, He was remarkable because he was unremarkable. And he told me, anyone in Gaza could be Yahya Sinwar, because he told me, you are Italian, you are European, no? So you can decide your life, no? You decide what you study, everything, no? But if you are Palestinian, and especially if you are a Palestinian from Gaza, your life decides you know, who you are, who you will be. I mean, you are shaped by the events, you know, well, you are shaped by the occupation and by Israel, you know. And that's why I say, that's what I mean when I say it was average, you know. It was a product, you know, of the life he lived, basically. And if he could see me now, if he could watch me now, he would say, I'm sure, he would say, don't speak of me, speak of Gaza. Speak of Gaza, speak of the kids of Gaza. And my first image of Yahya Sinwar, honestly, the first that comes to my mind is not his image, but what was around him the first time I met him. These children on the beach, it's very typical of Gaza. Well, now the Gaza doesn't exist anymore. It was very typical of Gaza. These children, you know the children of Gaza that you ask them, how old are you? And they said, oh, I'm 7 years old and 3 wars. And so they were sitting, you know, on the beach, on the sand at sunset, you know, and they just were watching, you know, watching the sea, and they were wondering what life looks like across the sea, what the world looks like across the sea, you know. And Yahya Sinwar told me, you know, I just don't want my children, the children of Gaza, to live like this. And that's it, I mean. And then, you know, what is the point, you know? I mean, who is really responsible, you know, for what is happening, you know? Those who close the borders, or those who are trying, you know, to break, basically, the barriers and to open the borders again. All his life, you know, was to end the siege of Gaza.
It sounds like there was a really sort of philosophical element to his personality. Is that sort of how, am I correctly understanding you?
He was absolutely smart, absolutely. He knew what he wants, you know. He listened to everybody. He also was always thinking a lot. And then when he took a decision, he just went straight. Absolutely, was absolutely smart. But once again, you know, he really tried everything before October 7. He really tried everything, you know. He was in a corner. And actually, when I got that interview, it was a totally different moment. Hamas was very weak because there was still the siege, and Palestinians, of course, you know, were furious with Israel, you know, but were furious with Hamas also, with Fatah, with the PA, with everybody, with the world, of course, with the international community. But basically, they were blaming Hamas, which also we know, you know, is not really a nice regime, you know, with the internal freedoms and everything. And they were blaming Hamas for, basically, they were saying, okay, you are unable to break the siege, you know, you keep firing these rockets and then we get a war. Because, you know, October 7, this is the 5th war of Gaza, not for sure, not the first one. And so it was very weak at the moment, you know. He really tried everything. At that point, I mean, the title of my interview now, it really sounds like a different word. The title was, I don't want war anymore. And he was honest. I mean, he was not lying. For 1 year, there were negotiations with Hamas. He tried, you know, to break the siege in that way, and nothing. The international community was looking away, you know. Palestinians were totally forgotten. No one was really pressing Netanyahu. Netanyahu was absolutely strong. He was about, you know, to sign the Abraham Accords. We didn't know that. And that's how Sinwar and Hamas changed, you know. But definitely, you know, he was always, I mean, studying the circumstances and adjusting, you know, to the circumstances. Absolutely. I really don't understand why, you know, Western media, and I'm a Western journalist, unfortunately, I don't understand why they keep, you know, describing Sinwar like something like absolute evil, or, you know, I don't know, a bloody what? I mean, the occupation is bloody. And he was absolutely rational.
Yes, but Francesca, to be fair, I mean, he did have blood on his hands. I mean, you clearly saw one aspect of his personality, but, you know, the Israeli Prime Minister was very clear yesterday saying he had blood on his hands, and not just Israeli blood. He could be pretty ruthless could he not, with the people of Gaza, especially if you crossed Yahya Sinwar? I mean, we're not talking about someone who was always perhaps as charming as he came across in front of a Western journalist.
No, absolutely. And I always say, when at the end, when my interview was over, so I was writing down everything, I was in front of my laptop, and then I received a newsletter, Amnesty International, so in the very moment I was taking the picture with him, a few meters away, like 300 meters away, in a square of Gaza, Hamas was basically executing publicly 6 let's say, traitors. I mean, Hamas was accusing them to be traitors, spy, whatever, 3 opponents, 3. I will never forget it, exactly in the same moment, But look, this is nothing new, And, I mean, even when we speak, of the Palestinians supporting Hamas, I think for the situation, Palestine is in with the last elections held, in 2006, also, when we say, okay, Hamas has been democratically elected, so is, legitimate, ruler of Gaza. Well, the elections were in 2006, so nobody is more, a legitimate ruler of Palestine under this point of view. The point is, for Palestinians, is always, and for the Middle East, I would say, a choice of the lesser evil,
Sure.
So what is the lesser evil? It is not by, if you see the polls, always, in the West Bank, Hamas is stronger than Fatah. Why? Because it's not in power. In Gaza, well, in the polls, Fatah is stronger than Hamas. Why? Because he's not in power. It's a way, to say that, it's the lesser evil. In that moment, Hamas was like, Hamas stands for, reaction. Really, that image of, throwing a stick at the drone, well, that's the symbol of Hamas.
Okay.
Hamas as an
All right.
idea is that image.
All right. I'm so sorry to cut you short, Francesca. We're out of time. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, though, and we really appreciate you taking the time. Francesca Bori, thank you very much indeed. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Budapest. Many would consider Budapest a favorite city in Europe. It boasts of great architecture comparable to none, and lets us in on its sophisticated scene that's impossible for any other city to imitate. Here are some things you'll appreciate about Budapest. A visit to the city's thermal baths is a must. Try soaking in the Széchenyi baths, although of course there are countless other baths to choose from. A cruise via the Danube River is another thing you must do in Budapest. Nighttime is the best time to try this. There are special cruises being offered as ways to maximize your scenic trip along the river. For one, you can have a buffet-style dinner cruise while on board. Definitely a feast for the eyes, but may become an educational tour for you too. One of the greatest bridges in the world is Budapest's Chain Bridge. It's the best place in the city for romantic evening strolls. It has a well-known story behind it too. The architect who had created it was greatly proud of his work that he challenged anyone to find fault in the bridge. It was soon discovered that the lions that stand guard at the opposite ends are missing their tongues, and his genius work remains forever. Budapest is also known for its great undergrounds. The labyrinth of Buda Castle is one of the 7 wonders of the underground world. The place has also got many stories to tell, having closed down in 2011, but has already reopened. There are also many cave systems along Budapest to tour, for both a learning and travel experience. There are also wine cellars in the city, which are part of the vast labyrinth system winding beneath Buda Castle. The cellars vary, but are all suitable for wine tasting. It's an experience to learn more about their wine culture, for both learning and travel experience. For shopping, there's the Central Market Hall. Here you'll find the typical Hungarian products. You'll find everything there, from the world-famous sausages, paprika, to their wines. Fresh vegetables are also among the great buys in the market. You'll also find great souvenirs to buy there, such as wares and traditional Hungarian embroidery.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,